World News Today, brought to you by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast direct from important overseas capitals, as well as the leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefronts. But first, here's John Daly with a summary of headline news as received in New York.
In these first days of 1943, we of the United Nations have set our feet firmly on the long road to victory. On the military fronts, we are on the offensive. It may be a long, hard pull, but we can face the future with confidence. Even in Tunisia, in French North Africa, the military situation looks bright. But at the same time, a political situation has developed which introduces a discordant note into the unity so necessary to our military operations. For the latest developments in French North Africa, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS Algiers, Charles Collingwood reporting.
This is Charles Collingwood, Allied Force Headquarters in North Africa. Yesterday saw the most terrific air battles that had yet taken place in the North African sky. When the day was over, the scores stood 28 Axis planes destroyed by Soviet and 34 damaged to 7 Allied planes shot down. This is the way it happened. A strong force of flying fortresses went out to bomb. On the way back, the fortresses ran into a force of about 50 German and Italian fighters lying in wait for them over the Tunis area. X-38, which were escorting the fortresses, got 2 more and lost 36. That makes 19 German planes down. The 20th was a Junkers 88.
We regret that interference makes Mr. Collingwood's reports from Algiers unlistenable. He was reviewing the story of recent Allied air activity in which Allied bomber squadrons supported by P-38s and P-40s, our best fighter planes, have been smashing at all of the Axis supply ports on the eastern Tunisian coast. At Sfax and Gabas and Sousse, the Axis has been repeatedly bombed until those supply ports are reported in shambles. Insofar as the political situation is concerned, Generals de Gaulle and Giraud are now reported exchanging correspondence to arrange a meeting to iron out the political difference among Frenchmen fighting the Axis. The London spokesman of the fighting French reports that further correspondence will be necessary, a not altogether promising sign. Next, for the news from the European front, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS London, Bob Trout reporting.
London, generally, is a pretty quiet place on Sundays. There's not really been what you would call a hectic Sunday since that Sunday the Allies landed in Africa. Today, London heard about the continued heavy Allied air attacks on the island of Crete, some of them made by United States Army Air Force bombers operating under the Royal Air Force Middle East Command. 30 of these American bombers took part in yesterday's large-scale daylight attack on Crete, the first big daylight raid on the island since the Germans captured it more than 18 months ago. From French North Africa came those dispatches to London saying that the American flyers yesterday had their busiest day since the Allied landing. There was little news from the British First Army in Tunisia. Apparently, large numbers of American troops are still needed to police the areas in Algeria and Morocco, the communication lines, which the late Admiral Darlan was supposed to make safe. But there's never any news about that. Home-based Royal Air Force fighters were flying back and forth over the cold straits of Dover during the afternoon. Formations of high-flying fighters left their vapor trails in the clear, bright sky above the French coast. 4 German fighter bombers dropped their bombs on a small southeast coast town of England, hitting an empty church and an empty school, as well as a few houses. When the 4 small German planes were seen coming in from the sea, they were high up and still climbing. Cautiously, they dropped their bombs from 15,000 feet, nearly 3 miles. As you would expect, some of the bombs fell into the sea. London Sunday newspapers printed prominently the United States State Department's white paper outlining the record of the American policy of avoiding war, which finally came to an end on that December 7th when the Axis countries demonstrated they were operating under a different policy. The London papers published the report under such headlines as U.S. was warned of aggression and U.S. was warned about Pearl Harbor attacks year before Japan struck. Now back to New York and John Daly.
More news in just a moment. But first, here is Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
Here's the picture of an event we hope never happens.
Why, Emily, there's nothing to fix in a radio. Here, let me show you. Stand back out of my way now. A couple of wires come apart. That's all's the matter. Oh, broken. I've fixed it all right. A screwdriver slipped and smashed a tube. Emily, this would never have happened if you'd stood back like I told you.
And it never would have happened if that radio had been taken to an Admiral dealer for service. Now, a tube is broken, and since tubes are difficult to obtain, this family may have to do without radio until the war is over. Play safe. Make it your rule to call an Admiral dealer when your radio needs attention. Admiral dealers are trained in the science of radio. They are experts in servicing, and they have all the equipment and tools necessary to put your set in first-class condition quickly and economically. Radios are precious these days. Your set is worth more than you paid for it originally, because it probably can't be replaced until after victory is won. So treat it right. Call your Admiral dealer and know why people say Admiral service is America's assurance that the radios on the home front will last for the duration. Now, here once again for Admiral Radio, here's John Daly.
The official midday communique from Moscow reported new Red Army advances on the Central, Stalingrad, and Caucasus fronts. The communique was general rather than specific, but it reported that a strongly defended German base north of Veliki Luki was occupied and that the Red Army was 27 miles beyond Kotelnikovsky in the drive southwest of Stalingrad. The Germans are counterattacking both west and southwest of Stalingrad and west of Moscow, but the Russians report all attacks beat north and advances everywhere. For the moment, with the threat to Stalingrad lifted, probably the most important front is that west of Moscow in the vicinity of the German defenses in the Veliki Luki-Rizhev-Vyazma area. Much of the future progress of the Russian winter offensives depends on the ability of the Red Army to maintain its momentum in their attacks on the hedgehog defenses in depth, which the Germans built in this area after the failure to take Moscow in 1941. Press dispatches from the front are a little more specific than the noon communique about operations near Veliki Luki. But since they are dispatches, the news is, of course, unofficial. One dispatch reports that the Russians have cut the Leningrad-Vitebsk Railroad and advanced 14 miles along the Moscow-Riga line to Novosokolniki, only about 70 miles from the Latvian border. The cutting of the Leningrad-Vitebsk Railroad may mean that the siege of Leningrad will be lifted. That city is now in its second winter of siege, and the fact that the Red Army is concentrating so much strength in the Veliki Luki area is an indication that the lifting of the siege of Leningrad is also one of the objectives of the winter campaign. However, progress on the Central Front is comparatively slow and will probably remain so. The Germans have been digging in there for more than a year, behind a formidable system of fortifications, including concrete pillboxes, trenches, anti-tank traps, and all the other types of World War II tested defenses. These defenses, as most of you know, were built by the late Fritz Todt, who built the West Wall on Germany's French border. They are the sort of defenses which the Russians have been banging their heads against for a good many months. For instance, in the offensive against Rizhev, the Russians earlier this year reached the outskirts of the city itself, only then to have to turn back and hold their front-line positions without making any great progress forward. Now it's believed that the Russian armies have bypassed all of the Rizhev defenses, and the Rizhev city itself is still in German hands. The fact that the armies can sweep around Rizhev, the Russian armies, and still leave the Germans inside the city attests to the importance of this new kind of fortification which was built by the late Fritz Todt. It's a fortification which must be slowly and systematically crushed. Another important factor in assessing the potential of the Russian offensives is the cost to the Russians in manpower and material. We have no idea as to the extent of Russian casualties since the winter offensive began well over a month ago. We can be fairly sure that they have been large, perhaps so large that the Russians will have to accept limited objectives for the winter campaigns. However, there is one clear indication that the Russians have all the strength they need. Military men point out that if it was necessary to husband manpower, the Russians would not have spread their attack over such a large area. For instance, considering the Red Army's successes before Stalingrad and in the Middle Don, it was hardly necessary to launch another offensive in the Nalchik region of the Caucasus. With the fall of Veliki Luki, much, by the way, of the Germans, which, by the way, the Germans in their communique hint is still in their hands, there is good reason to feel that the Russian winter offensive will achieve successes that will perhaps even surprise the Russians themselves. Today, the communique, the noonday communique, which, as I said, was more general than specific, still reported that the Russian armies in all of the 7 fronts in which they are now fighting are continuing to make advances. They're advancing in the center, they're advancing both north and south of Stalingrad, and they are advancing in the Caucasus in the Nalchik region. It's a feat which nobody expected of the Russians, at least at this early date. But we might all do well to remember the old adage, don't count your chickens before they're hatched. Next, Admiral Radio takes you to Colombia's correspondent in Cairo.
Mr. Morrison in Cairo. I am limited in the things I can say to you because carriers but in the past week I have talked with many men who knew what with military and naval men, with civilians, and
We regret once again that interference has cut Mr. Morrison's report off from Cairo. This is evidently a bad day for shortwave broadcasting, but we will continue to call in CBS correspondents abroad, trying the Pacific area next. First of all, some of the news from Cairo, which Mr. Morrison was giving you. There is a hint today that a large-scale battle may be shaping up in Libya. It's reported that the British 8th Army is now in contact with the Axis forces in the Wadi Bey al-Kiba area, about 180 miles east of Tripoli. But a British communique says there's nothing to report on the progress of activity. Yesterday, the British radio said that the Axis forces were digging in at a point slightly farther to the west along the line of the Wadi Zemzem, a rugged, dried-up watercourse. It declared that the Axis had assembled some tanks at that point and that the enemy troops were building trenches and throwing up fortifications. Once again, we look for heavy action in the Libyan fighting. But at the same time, we must remember that General Montgomery's 8th Army has stretched itself additional hundreds of miles away from its main supply bases. That even now, the principal secondary supply bases may be as far back as El Agela, and it is going to take time to pull those supply forces forward so that the main armies can go into action. There has been increased action in the Pacific War area, so Admiral Radio turns next to CBS Honolulu, Webley Edwards reporting.
This is Pearl Harbor. The war on the vast Pacific front continues to step up in the frequency and intensity of aerial raids in the New Guinea, Bismarck Archipelago, and Solomon Islands regions, with the news highlighted this week by the announcement of the raid on Wake Island by American bombers in force. There's bitter and savage fighting on the Papuan Peninsula of New Guinea, where Allied troops are continuing to cut up stubborn Jap forces in the pockets along the Buna Beach area. But beyond this ground fighting and the constant patrol fighting on Guadalcanal, the big story is on the sea and in the air. This is the world's longest battlefront and its deepest. Land fighting is a series of battles for strong points fought over perhaps bloody but relatively unimportant areas of land. It's the same out here, with surface ships and bombing planes fighting for strong points, which are strategic islands moving through or over great stretches of ocean to get to these strong points of land. The Wake Island attack is the third on that island, the first at low level. It was a soul-satisfying raid to all who remember the Marines' great stand a year ago. But it is still more significant than that. There were evidently large planes in force carrying some 75,000 pounds of bombs through to Wake Island without the benefit of any landmark at sea, found the island, bombed it, and returned to their bases without mishap. Now mark this. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet and Pacific Ocean areas, made a significant remark in commenting on that raid. He said, and note it carefully, let the enemy take such consolation as he may from the thought that this raid is only a sample of things to come. Unquote. The Jap must now be alert wherever he holds land in the entire Pacific area. Ours is now the ability to choose the place where we will strike next and strike him first. It will come soon and also at a time of our choosing. Admiral Nimitz is not one to speak lightly. And when he says the Wake attack was but a sample, be assured he promises still greater attacks and still greater force. This despite the fact that the Pacific Fleet and the Pacific Army forces, with relatively small aid from our allies, this Pacific force of ours is fighting a war against Japan, a major world naval and military power. This is Webley Edwards at Pearl Harbor. We'll return you to CBS in New York.
We've heard the news of Africa, Europe, and the Pacific. Now, for some developments in Latin America, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Bogota, Jack Bendel reporting.
The war is being fought on many strange battlefronts and with many types of ammunition. This country is still neutral or non-belligerent. It broke diplomatic relations with the Axis powers right after the attack on Pearl Harbor. But part of the war is being fought today in the jungles of Colombia, only a few hours by plane from where I am speaking. Under the pressure of democracy's need for every ounce of rubber that it can scrape together, a force of Colombians and North Americans is cutting roads through jungles and laying out airfields so that the larger army of men who follow them will be able not only to gather rubber, but speed it onward to the United States. $1 million worth of United States money is the first ammunition in another phase of this war, as a group of American doctors and nurses starts a public health and sanitation campaign here. Their fight will be centered on disease here that don't respect national boundaries and neutrality laws and could easily spread to the nearby Panama Canal if unchecked. But while public opinion and many government surgeons here have centered their attention on domestic issues and economic problems, the Army is preparing for all eventualities and for the possibility that hostilities may come to the shore. Under War Minister Alejandro Galvez, a recent nationwide conference of high-ranking Colombian Army officers adopted measures which will place the Army practically on a war footing. Not all of those measures can now be revealed, but they include a unified command which will assure more efficient execution of military plans and directives, and more advanced training methods and the lessons of modern warfare. It has likewise been announced that War Minister Galvez, together with a group of generals and other officers, will visit the Panama Canal Zone sometime this month to inspect the defenses there. While this will ostensibly be a courtesy visit, it will undoubtedly give the opportunity to the authorities of the Canal Zone to discuss more coordinated plans for the defense of the Panama Canal, to which Colombia is so important geographically. This is Jack Sandell at Bogota, turning in now to CBS at New York.
We regret that atmospheric conditions have made so much interference in our shortwave pickups, but hope that the reports from Honolulu and Bogota were understandable. Now, for the news at home, Admiral Radio turns next to CBS Washington. Lee White reporting.
The Navy has just reported that American bombers in the Solomons have set one Japanese destroyer afire and left another in a sinking condition. The destroyer formation was first sighted off Shortland Island at 2:30 yesterday afternoon, Solomon's time. It was immediately bombed by a squadron of flying fortresses, but no hits were observed. 3.5 hours later, it was again attacked, this time off Rendova Island by a squadron of Douglas dive bombers protected by Wildcat and Airacobra fighters. The destroyers were escorted by Zero fighters, but these were taken care of by our own, while our bombers proceeded to bomb the surface squadron with good result. No more has been heard of the destroyer squadron since then, although it's reasonable to suppose that a number of ships got through to relieve the Japanese on Guadalcanal. There's been no land fighting on Guadalcanal of much importance lately. Just artillery duels, a clash between patrols now and then, daily air bombardments of the Japanese emplacements, and at least a daily raid on Munda, where the enemy is being harassed to prevent him from setting up a going airdrome. Major General Camel, Chief of Army Ordnance, announces that the production of tanks, guns, trucks, and munitions will be reduced in the coming year by from 10 to 20%. About $8 billion worth of contracts will be canceled. But more than this amount will be added to appropriations already outstanding for the manufacture of airplanes, merchant ships, and naval vessels. In 1943, according to the War Productions Board, will manufacture roughly 100,000 airplanes, with the emphasis on heavy bombers and cargo planes instead of fighters. Our merchant vessel goal for 1943 is 20 million tons. This year, we only produced 50,000 airplanes and a little over 8 million tons of merchant shipping. As you probably know by now, the value of Period 3 oil coupons will be cut at midnight to 9 instead of 10 gallons. And the issuance of B and C gasoline coupons will be resumed tomorrow, with the difference that this time a B card will only be good for 378 instead of 470 miles per month. You'll need a C coupon from now on, and they'll be hard to get if you have to travel 379 or more miles per month. Last night, the State Department issued a white paper on the tragic decade, beginning in 1931 with Japan's invasion of Manchuria and ending in 1941 at Pearl Harbor. It's 144 pages long and costs 25 cents. You can obtain it by writing to the Superintendent of Documents. I now return you to CBS New York and John Daly.
Here in New York is Columbia's military expert, Major George Fielding Elliott, with an analysis of the latest developments in the fighting in the Pacific. Major Elliott.
The capture of Buna Mission eliminates another Japanese foothold on the northern coast of Papua. But, as General MacArthur is careful to point out in his dispatch, it does not mean that the Japanese resistance in this part of New Guinea is ended. as the Japanese still hold a well-fortified position at Salamanda Point. The tenacity of the Japanese resistance indicates that they are aware of the importance of their positions in New Guinea and suggests that they are trying to delay the development of a two-pronged Allied attack on Rabaul in New Britain Island, their principal advanced base in the Southwest Pacific. The same consideration applies to the persistent and costly Japanese effort to establish and operate an air base at Munda in the New Georgia Islands, which stands between Rabaul and Guadalcanal, much as Buna stands between Rabaul and Port Moresby. So Japanese resistance at both these outlying posts be brought to an end, the way would be open for a twin advance of Allied forces with Rabaul as ultimate objective. Certainly the capture of Rabaul would not be easy. It is well fortified and will be stoutly defended. But with the loss of its covering outposts, it would be fatally isolated and exposed, and could be supported by the Japanese only from their great fleet base at Truk in the western Caroline Islands, almost 800 miles away. It would, under such circumstances, be necessary for the Japanese to decide whether the retention of Rabaul was worth the risk of their whole remaining fleet in a great naval action to attempt to restore Japanese command of the sea in this area. If not, they could only bid their garrison at Rabaul sell its lives as dearly as possible, as has been done at Buna and on Guadalcanal. Why is Rabaul so important? To the Japanese, because it covers the approaches to Truk and is a keystone of all their outpost system in the Southwest Pacific. From our point of view, Rabaul is of great consequence because its secure possession would enable us to set up there a great submarine base, moving the point of departure of our submarines hundreds of miles nearer to their target area, which is the sea immediately south of the Japanese main islands. Our submarines have been doing magnificent work in the Pacific, striking at Japan's most vulnerable point, her merchant shipping. On this shipping, the whole future ability of Japan to carry on the war depends. Already, operating from their distant bases, our submarines have shown results, sub for sub, about 3 times as great as those obtained by the German U-boats from the Atlantic. If they can have the additional advantage of a forward base like Rabaul, they will do far better. And we have new submarines coming constantly into service. The possession of Rabaul will be to us an immense advantage, which the Japanese cannot possibly afford to let us gain if they can find means to prevent it.
Now here is Warren Sweeney with a word for Admiral Radio.
We're going to let you hear an authentic sound, the noise to be heard inside a tank during battle.
3rd Battalion, advance to Hill 51. 3rd Battalion, advance to Hill 51.
That's the sound inside a tank during battle. And if you listen closely, you heard the tank crews getting orders by radio. Those radios, Admiral is making many of them, perform the miracles of this war. Credit for their design must go to the men of the Signal Corps. Credit for building them must go to American workers. The men and women, for example, on the assembly lines of Admiral's 2 great plants. Admiral workers are conscious that they're doing something bigger than they've ever done before. They're building radio equipment upon which American men will depend for safety, for efficiency, yes, and for their very lives. Good equipment is built because of this spirit. Victory will come sooner and at a far lesser cost because of it. And with victory, Admiral will again take its place as the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonograph combinations with automatic record changers. Have you heard the latest rumor? Then keep it to yourself. This doesn't mean Americans are forbidden to talk about the war. Talk about it all you wish. But don't mention something merely because you heard someone else say it. Talk only about the things you yourself read in a reliable newspaper or you yourself hear on the radio. Let's beat the Axis. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from the leading news centers of the world. Warren Sweeney speaking. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
This is the WBBM Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago.
The story behind the headlines. In cooperation with the American Historical Association, we again present Caesar Searchinger, noted foreign correspondent and writer, in an informal analysis of the news. Mr. Searchinger retraces the events of the past to help you in arriving at a fuller understanding of what is happening today. Mr. Searchinger's subject tonight is Russia's Winter Offensive No. 2. Mr. Searchinger.
Good evening. The sensation of the week was the Russian war communique concerning the winter offensive on the Volga and the Don. Released on New Year's Eve, it came as a fillip to New Year's celebrations all over the world. Added to this summary of Russian victories was yesterday's news of the recapture of Veliki Luki, one of the famous strong points on the Central Front, and today's announcement of the retaking of Mozdok, deep in the Caucasus. All this calls for cool analysis and a warning not to let our optimism get out of hand. As the winter offensive runs into its 7th week, we see that it has already accomplished much, and that the results are far from decisive as yet. A great deal has been said about encirclement, about trapping the Nazi armies, not only before Stalingrad, but in the Caucasus. But it must be remembered that no army is decisively beaten until it surrenders, nor does it cease to be a danger until it is destroyed. No German army in the present offensive has yet surrendered, and the armies which are said to have been routed are still in the field. However, according to the Russian communique, over 300,000 men and officers have been killed or taken prisoner. This alone is an important victory in the war of attrition, which has already begun, and it is without precedent for the Russian side in the present war. The Russian communique helps us to clear up a rather confusing picture. Hitherto, it has been difficult to follow the campaign, although the outlines of the Don-Volga region are pretty familiar by now. There is the long line of the lower Volga centering at Stalingrad, and further west, the wide sweep of the Don, that enormous elbow pointing eastward towards the long contested Volga city. For months, the area between the two rivers, at one point only 50 miles wide, has been the bloodiest battlefield of the war. We must bear firmly in mind the picture of this German salient reaching right into Stalingrad and to the Volga bank, the high watermark of the Nazi eastward drive. 6 weeks ago, the Russians launched a typical pincers movement with fresh armies striking fiercely at the roots and sides of this Stalingrad wedge. The Russian pincers, starting northwest and southwest of Stalingrad, reached the banks of the Don, pushing towards their bight and virtually encircling 22 Axis divisions, or upwards of 200,000 troops. It would, however, be slightly inaccurate to say that this Axis army was trapped. To trap or contain an army so that it can be wiped out afterwards would require a surrounding army at least double the size, say 45 divisions. The Russians evidently could not concentrate such an overwhelming mass and still continue offensive operations elsewhere as they did. The Germans have, moreover, transformed the so-called trap into one of their famous hedgehogs, fortified areas which are very difficult to reduce. This, in part, explains why the Nazis still managed to hang on in the blockhouses of Stalingrad itself. So much for the Stalingrad encirclement, which the Russian communique describes as the first stage of the offensive. The second stage began on December 16th, with an attack across the middle Don on a 40-mile front about 175 miles west of Stalingrad. This drive smashed south and southwestward into the rear of the German forces inside the Don elbow. It advanced from 90 to 125 miles at different points and bypassed the town of Milorovo on both sides. Milorovo is not only an important German supply depot, but the junction of two main railroad lines, from east to west and from north to south. These railroads connect key centers like Rostov and Kharkov, both of which must be major Russian objectives if the offensive is to accomplish its main purpose. But these places are still respectively 100 and 150 miles beyond the Russian spearheads, and Milorovo itself is still in German hands. The third stage of the Russian offensive, simultaneous with the second, was and is a drive to the southwest of Stalingrad along the main railroad connecting Stalingrad with Rostov and the Black Sea. It was the cutting of this railroad, you'll remember, by the Nazis that started their drive into the Caucasus last July. About last Wednesday, the Russians retook Kotelnikov, an important station on this railroad about 90 miles down the line. They have now reached a point about halfway between Stalingrad and Rostov. Meanwhile, they have begun to push other spearheads straight south into the Kalmyk steppes, in an effort to drive the Germans out of the northern Caucasus area. They have now reached and taken the Kalmyk capital of Elista and have captured a significantly large number of trucks. This is an almost roadless, desolate region inhabited till recently by nomad tribes. Altogether, the Great Winter Offensive has liberated over 1,000 towns and villages, regained large stretches of territory, and netted enormous amounts of booty. More important, perhaps, is the capture of Nazi communications. Both the main railroads to Stalingrad have been cut, and so has one of the lateral lines. So far, this does not, however, sufficiently disrupt the German supply system, which depends to a large extent on trucks, many of them with caterpillar treads for cross-country work. Here is another reason why the encircled German armies are not entirely isolated as yet, and why islands of German resistance are likely to be difficult to destroy. Last year, on the Central Russian front, the Germans successfully supplied their beleaguered forces, notably at Staraya Russa, by air. This year, the beleaguered Stalingrad hedgehog is said to be relying more and more on air transport for food. This may prove far more difficult, since an increasing part of the Nazis' air strength is now needed in North Africa. It is still too early to estimate the full value of the Russian offensive to date, but it already presents some interesting contrasts with the winter offensive of last year. That offensive was simply a frontal attack along the line of least resistance against a retreating enemy. The present one is a strategic movement against an enemy who means to stay put. Last year, the Russians pushed back the German armies, regaining chunks of territory all along the 2,000-mile front. Much of that territory, in fact, was more or less willingly abandoned by the Germans, except for that famous chain of strong points, or hedgehogs, including Veliki Luki, Staraya Russa, Rzhev, Vyazma, and Orel. The present offensive, however, is not a simple push, but a well-planned, intricate strategic operation on the grand scale. It comprises a series of pincer movements and spearhead thrusts into the German flanks. It is designed to cut off large areas, envelop strong forces, and cut supply lines at critical points. In short, this time the Russians are not interested in taking back strips of land, but in reconquering whole provinces and annihilating the invading armies. The Russian tactics, too, are different this year. They've been using mobile artillery with great effect, at direct firing range, and a large number of excellent tanks. These they have been accumulating all summer and all fall, holding them back while waiting for the big push. A remarkable example of confident leadership, for the retreating Red armies were taking terrific punishment all the time. The Russians are also advancing at much greater speed this year. This is important, for much depends on their ability to take the German strong points quickly, so they can move on to the ultimate goals. Their principal goal in the southern offensive is, of course, to drive the Nazis from the Caucasus and the eastern Ukraine. The Nazi invasion of the Caucasus has been likened to a grasping arm into the store cupboard past a sliding door of heavy steel. Its success depended on whether there was someone strong enough to put a shoulder against the door and make it move. Well, the door has begun to move, but it's still far from being shut. Not only is there still a gap of 100 miles, but those last 100 miles will be the hardest. The Germans will do their utmost to keep that door from sliding shut. But the Russians appear to be out for more. They are aiming to undermine the German positions all along the line from Leningrad to the Caucasus Mountains and the Black Sea. To do that means finding a way to crack those aforementioned strong points, or centers of resistance, that the Germans have established all along the front. These so-called hedgehogs, with bristles represented by pillboxes, blockhouses, and multilateral interlocking fire points, have in most cases defied the most violent mass assaults. The Russians succeeded in reducing one of these hedgehogs, Mozhaisk, last winter, after one of the fiercest artillery duels of the war. More recently, they failed at Staraya Russa, despite complete encirclement and concentric attack. Rzhev, too, has resisted periodical attacks for nearly a year. That is why the capture of Veliki Luki must rank as one of the few really conclusive victories of the Russian war, for it was one of the key hedgehog positions of the Nazi front. This may mean that the Russians have found their answer to the new form of German defensive warfare, just as General Montgomery found his answer to Rommel's version of it at El Alamein. The conditions on the two fronts are radically different, of course. In Russia, the intervening spaces are defended by mobile troops. In the shelterless desert of Egypt, deep minefields played an important role. Montgomery cracked Rommel's defense in depth by the use of direct artillery fire and infantry, opening a path for tanks, thus reversing the blitzkrieg pattern of armored attack. We do not yet know the Russian methods in detail. It might be useful to learn them, for conditions in Tunisia are similar in some respects to Russia. Here, the Germans managed to construct a defensive system near Bizerte and Tunis, which threw General Anderson's army back within 20 miles of its goal. We are witnessing the latest phase of that perennial contest between the merits of attack and defense, which makes up an interesting part of the history of war. The War of 1914 became a 3-year stalemate because the defense, thanks to trenches, machine guns, and barbed wire, had become stronger than the attack. At the outset of the present war, the Germans were able to restore the war of movement by the use of fast tanks in conjunction with dive bombers and motorized infantry, and so attack regained the upper hand. But when the Germans were unable to knock out the Russian army in a single blitzkrieg campaign, they in their turn had to devise a new and stronger system of defense. This hedgehog system has proved a fairly effective antidote to armored and motorized attack. Apparently, the Allies are now beginning to master this system by tactics of their own. Summing up, the Russian achievements are certainly impressive. Between them and conclusive success stand great difficulties due to the necessity of holding a 2,000-mile front and breaking strong points of resistance all along that front. But all the while, the Russians are weakening the Axis striking power. They are keeping Hitler from arresting his reserves during the winter months. They are preventing him from undertaking any really radical countermeasures to our opening of the North African front, such as an attack through Spain, for instance. They are complicating his problem of what the experts call logistics, or bringing men and material to bear on strategic points. For as we increase our forces in Tunisia, Hitler must increase his. And so long as the Russians retain the initiative, these reinforcements cannot be taken from the Eastern Front. These Axis difficulties are bound to increase, but it would be foolish to believe that they have reached a critical stage. For the moment, we must not look for quick, sensational results. The stakes in Russia and Tunisia are enormous, and decisions will therefore be contested with ferocious will. We must not be fooled into thinking that victory is near. The hard work has hardly begun. Good night.
You have been listening to Caesar Searchinger, whom we've presented in cooperation with the American Historical Association. The story behind the headlines is a public service feature and has originated in New York. This is the National Broadcasting.
World News Today, brought to you by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast direct from important overseas stations, as well as the leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefronts. But first, here's John Daly.
Heavy Allied air activity in Europe, in Africa, and in the Pacific is making secure the hard-won hold on the initiative that the United Nations have gained on all the fronts of this war. In French North Africa, the political situation has held the center of the stage. But every day, the military reports have told the story of Allied flyers pounding at the Axis supply ports and strafing and bombing Axis land communications. This is the all-important preliminary to any all-out land offensive. British planes bombed and machine-gunned enemy vehicles on the roads leading from the port of Sfax in Tunisia, and other Allied airmen continued to hammer at Axis targets around the clock. The raids were carried out by the new Bisley planes of the Royal Air Force. Meanwhile, French headquarters announced that French troops fighting northwest of Kairouan had seized several important points near Jebel de Babou. And now, for the news direct from French North Africa, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Algiers' Charles Collingwood reporting. We regret that due to transmission difficulties, we are not able to get the report from Charles Collingwood in Tunisia right now, so we turn to London for the report of a big air raid on Berlin. For the details, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS London, Bob Trout reporting.
London expects to get the details of last night's raid on Berlin sometime after midnight tonight, British time. So far, what we know about the Royal Air Force attack is that a strong force of heavy British bombers dropped a great weight of bombs on Berlin, and large fires were seen from the air. One bomber is missing from the strong force. Last night's was the 54th Royal Air Force raid on Berlin. The 53rd was made on a night in November 1941. So, you see, Berlin went through the whole year of 1942 without a raid from the Royal Air Force, but the Russians were over Berlin a number of times. However, those early raids on Berlin were on a small scale, a very different operation from the kind that is now considered a normal raid, made on the principles of concentration and saturation of defenses, made with greater numbers of big four-engine bombers with their bombs of 4,000 pounds and 8,000 pounds. Those old raids were usually directed against single, important war targets, railroad stations, for instance, factories and power plants. If British bombers fly the most direct route to Berlin from this country, they have to cover some 1,200 miles, much of the journey over enemy territory. When the Royal Air Force planes arrive at the German capital, they have to face very powerful defenses. Still, from last night's raid, only one British plane is missing. London was glad to get today's Cairo communique telling us of the opening of a new phase of the Battle of Tripolitania, but London was not surprised. Those strange German reports put out yesterday about fierce battles in which the Axis forces had stopped the Eighth Army bore a strong resemblance to those fake German reports which were put out back at El Agela. This latest forward drive of the Eighth Army began at 7 o'clock Friday morning, and the latest reports in London are that the forward movement has been uninterrupted and the British have advanced some 40 or 50 miles from Wadi Zemzem. A British correspondent at the front with General Montgomery's forces says that the start of the Eighth Army's new drive is the biggest moment since El Alamein. And now back to New York and John Daly.
More news in just a moment, but first here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
Several days ago, one of the CBS reporters heard on this program, Charles Collingwood, gave the world its first news of the French royalist plot to establish a monarchy in North Africa. Right now, you are listening to the dramatic story of history-making events. And in months to come, radio will give you every step in the complete defeat of the Axis. There's a story you won't want to miss. And the one way to make sure of hearing every single chapter is to take care of your radio. For you won't be able to get a new set until after the complete story is told. At present, your Admiral dealer can put almost any radio in perfect shape, regardless of make or condition. But as the weeks roll by, new parts will become increasingly difficult to obtain. So the wise man will call his Admiral dealer now and have minor adjustments made before vital parts are too far gone to be repaired. Remember, your radio set is a precious instrument, your only way of hearing the story of the battles as they're fought. And remember also, your Admiral dealer is the expert who will do everything possible to keep your radio in tip-top shape for the duration. Admiral dealers have the facilities, the knowledge, and the backing of Admiral. In peacetime, the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonograph combinations with automatic record changers. Now, here once again, for Admiral Radio, is John Daly.
Now for news of the situation along the Pacific war fronts, Admiral Radio takes you after a few seconds' pause to CBS Australia, William J. Dunn reporting.
Australia's eternal bugaboo shortage of manpower promises to become even more serious during the few months just ahead. Prime Minister Curtin's statement that at least another 210,000 persons will be needed for war work or for active service within the next 6 months poses a situation which he himself described as of utmost gravity. 210,000 persons doesn't sound so large when considered in the light of America's population. But in a nation of 7 million, where more than 1 out of every 10 persons is wearing the uniform of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, or one of the women's auxiliaries, it's a staggering order. Actually, 210,000 Australians is a proportion equal of nearly 4 million Americans. And when America reaches its 4th year of war, 4 million able-bodied men and women not already working for the war effort will be hard to find. The Prime Minister is frank in his admission that the answer to this problem has not yet been found. But unless the answer is found, the probable alternatives are curtailment of war production or starving the services of reinforcements, he said. General Sir Thomas Blamey, commander of the Allied land forces in the Southwest Pacific area, in a radio talk to Australia a few hours ago, warned against any feeling that our signal success in Papua meant that the Japanese menace to Australia has ended. He praised the joint work of the American and Australian soldier in the Buna campaign, but predicted that Japan is still anxious to eliminate Australia as a possible Allied base from which a successful offensive might be launched. He pointed out that in New Guinea, the peril of tropical diseases was even more deadly than the menace of the Japanese. This is William J. Dunn in Australia. I return you to CBS in New York.
In the Far East, British bombers supporting the British drive in western Burma against Akyab successfully bombed targets on Akyab Island, and heavy bombers of the United States 10th Air Force left a 7,000-ton Jap cargo vessel sinking and another ship damaged in a Jap convoy south of Rangoon. Thus, new news of aerial activity in the Far East. Besides these major raids, today, Allied flyers, mostly fighters, dropped light bombs and machine gun Jap trains and coastal shipping. The ground forces are still fighting about 25 miles from Akyab. Once again, the reports, as in Europe, from the Far East are reports of air activity, of Allied efforts to smash at the enemy's communications, not only to smash at his principal bases of communication and supply, but also to cut into his equipment for the transport of those supplies. The news from Cairo this morning that the British 8th Army is again on the offensive is news that is good news because we've waited for it for several days. The latest dispatches say that the Allied forces have swept to within 110 miles of the Axis base of Tripoli. You'll remember that the British 8th Army struck Friday at 2 points, at the center of the Axis line and also at the Axis right flank. It skirted the impassable depression there and drove into the open desert where Rommel has little chance of digging in for another stand. Thus, the news of Montgomery's 8th Army once again in action. And it's news that ties in with the news of the French force that came up from the Lake Chad area in Africa and which, for the past several weeks, has been winning one battle after another. This French force is, of course, still several hundred miles south of Tripoli, still several hundred miles south of the flank of Rommel's army. But it's a factor that has to be considered in the fighting that is going on now in Tripolitania. How far the French force will be able to move without further supplies and perhaps without having to wait some time to pull up major supplies from its bases, no one as yet can tell. But it's very possible that the British 8th Army may find itself operating with a friend on its flank much sooner than it's expected. We expect to have the news from Cairo direct. Bob Trout has already given us a report on the fighting in Libya from London. And for further details, Admiral Radio takes you now direct to the Columbia correspondent in Cairo.
The 8th Army, having pushed through the German defenses west of Buarat, continued the attack today and kept up the pressure on Rommel's fighting rear guard. General Montgomery's advanced units were heading up the tarmac road that leads north to Misurata. They were striking across hard desert to the west and northwest. They were pursuing the enemy in 3 directions, while supply columns with fuel and ammunition were piling after them. Latest reports placed British forward troops on a line that runs roughly east to west across 50 miles of Tripolitanian Plateau. The westernmost point on that line is due south of Homs. The battle that picked the Afrika Corps out of the Buarat area on Friday night was the first head-on clash British have had with the enemy since Alamein. But it was not a large-scale battle. Rommel did not pit his whole strength against us. He did not have all his available forces lined up along the Zemzem Gully. He had already withdrawn a fair number of his troops so that he could make a fast getaway when he saw the British steamroller coming. At the same time, he massed enough guns and armor around Zemzem to make the British attack. It was familiar Rommel tactic, delaying as long as he could with a minimum of losses when it came to a showdown. British troops are now rampant in open desert, and I imagine Rommel will have a harder time now than he did at the Gala in keeping the place littered with minefields. But there's no reason to think the 8th Army will have a clean, easy sweep all the way to Tripoli. The eastern approaches to that city are covered by a chain of hills slanting inland from the coast near Homs. So Rommel may practice his favorite delaying technique again. He has an estimated 50,000 troops, including some crack German infantry battalions. Somewhere in the background, he has 3 Italian divisions. I don't think any of these are going to stop the 8th Army for long, but there will probably be a few more hurdles to scale before the British get to Tripoli. This is Winston Burdett in Cairo. I return you now to CBS in New York.
Again, we turn to the Pacific for some intimate glimpses of the war in that theater. Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Honolulu. Webley Edwards reporting.
Share of the credit for the capture and retention of our base in Guadalcanal must go to the American fighter plane squadron. Just returned to Pearl Harbor are 2 young naval officers who actually controlled many of the spectacular combats in the skies above the Solomons. These are Commander John H. Griffin of Annapolis, Maryland, who directed fighter operations for the carrier, and Ensign William Knoll of Pasadena, California, who directed Marine, Navy, and Army fighter groups out of Guadalcanal. Commander Griffin, is your carrier still doing her stuff against the Japs?
She sure is. Her boys are knocking the Zeros and Kawanisis for a loop every time they can find them.
They tell us you fellows have been shooting them down at a rate of 4 fire to 1 down there. How do you account for this?
The main reasons are better pilots with lots of armor in the seats of their pants. The good old Grumman Wildcat is a sturdy airplane, and plenty of 50-caliber machine guns don't do any harm either. In fleet operations such as those we have just been through, the accuracy and volume of our ship's anti-aircraft fire is another powerful factor on our side.
In what recent battle did you observe these factors most effectively combined?
In the off the Santa Cruz Islands, on our squadrons and anti-aircraft knocked down more than 100 Jap planes.
Do you expect important carrier battles in the future?
Certainly. We've got to wipe out the Japs' carriers before we hit him where he lives.
Commander, do you recall any particular incident that typifies the makeup of our flyers?
Yes. One day when our force was being shadowed by a 4-engine Kawanishi, I directed the combat patrol to attack. In a few minutes, both the Jap and our patrol disappeared from view. I was getting pretty anxious about the result of the chase, but I hated to bother our fighters by asking unnecessary questions when I knew they were plenty busy. When I could restrain myself no longer, I asked the leader, "What's the dope? Any luck?" He came right back with a model 4-word report. Kawanishi found and down.
Commander, did your force have a hand in turning the Japs back in the big battles around Savo Island in November?
Our battleships, cruisers, and destroyers did, of course, and our air group dished out plenty of damage on their own. Our dive bombers and torpedo planes got in their licks on the transports, and the fighters sure knocked down their share of the Zeros. Bill Knoll can tell you more about the operations down at Guadalcanal.
How about that, Bill?
Every pilot did a great job, and I think that General Woods of the Marine Corps deserves a lot of credit. It was a wonderful example of a unified command. Not only the Marines, but the Navy and the Army and the New Zealand squadrons, too, were there. And the General had them working together, not as separate units, but as one force. Attack groups often consisted of Navy torpedo planes and Army bombers, escorted by combined Navy and Marine fighters. But both the Army and Navy pilots had to take off their hats, the Marine dive bomber pilots. They were the workhorses the entire campaign.
They tell me operating conditions on Henderson Field are pretty tough.
Conditions are still difficult, but they were a lot worse in October. The pilots didn't live as aviators are popularly supposed to. They slept in muddy foxholes at night when they could sleep, and ate when they could find the time. The pilots were billeted only a half mile from the Japanese positions. They fought Jap raids, mud and dust every day. There was no picnics for the mechanics either. The pilots' success in shooting down so many Japs was in a large part due to the mechanics' upkeep of their planes.
In a word, what's the air situation down there today, Commander Griffin?
The situation's a lot better than it was last August, but we still have a tough job ahead of us. Our boys who are meeting the Japs over the Solomons every day must have a continuous flow of planes, ships, and supplies. These must constantly increase.
Thank you, Commander John Griffin and Ensign William Knoll, for your excellent close-up of our air operations against the Jap and the Solomons. Good luck. This is Webley Edwards at Pearl Harbor. We return you to CBS in New York.
Biggest United Nations successes are still in Russia. For that story, here is Larry Lesseur, Columbia's correspondent who recently returned from Moscow.
The ice of the frozen river Don is blotched with red today, and Adolf Hitler's prestige among the German people, and above all within the German army, is being struck the first of many blows from which it will never recover. Those red banner armies of Russia are surging back over the white blanketed wheat fields of the Soviet Southwest, and the rich black earth which Hitler's conquered last summer, at such a cost of blood and machines, is slipping from the frozen fingers of his armies at a rate which astounds everyone, except the Russians. In that red-walled citadel set up in the center of snowy Moscow, called the Kremlin, the Russian High Command is planning its moves as carefully as on a chessboard. And today, with a smashing move against the remnants of Hitler's cracked Fifth Army trapped outside Stalingrad, they are calling checkmate on Hitler's last summer offensive against the Volga and his chief city, Stalingrad. From every side, the heavy-booted, fur-hatted peasant army of Russia is pouring fire into these 75,000 Germans and Romanians who have denied any way of escape. Here, the trapped Germans are holding 60,000 starving Russian peasants and workers as hostages. Many persons have forgotten the great migration of Russian factories and workers from the conquered lands last year, but the workers haven't forgotten. Settled now in new homes east of the Volga, in the Urals and Siberia, their factories are now turning out equipment which is making the present Russian offensive possible. And with every step that they advance, the Red Army is winning back for its wives and mothers in the factories the richest agricultural lands in all Europe. Every foot of this blood-soaked black earth will grow food for Russia next spring. The Russians make a practice of never announcing an offensive until it's achieved some success, but there are rumors that they are moving to free Leningrad at the long end of the battle line. Just a year ago today, I talked to the Russian general who will play a great role in this gigantic task. Dark, incisive-looking General Gavorov, smasher of the Finnish Mannerheim land, the artillery expert who cracked the German stronghold at Mozháysk. I talked to him in the smoking ruins of Mozháysk, 60 miles in front of Moscow. He said, "We are counting on our allies, and until they are ready, we will give the invaders no rest until they are finally driven across the frontiers of Russia."
There are many news developments at home today also. For that news, Admiral Radio takes you next to CBS Washington, Lee White reporting.
If you look at your calendar, you'll find, as I did, that March 15th is only 8 weeks hence. And unless Congress gets busy and passes some plan for paying as you go between now and then, March 15th is liable to cause a breakdown in our tax-collecting machinery. The Treasury says everyone's got to make his return and arrange for lump or quarterly payment of his taxes between now and March 15th, or take the customary consequences in the form of a cash penalty. But many people, especially here in Washington, are certain that some form of pay-as-you-go will last, and they're not planning to make any income tax returns until it is. This means that the Treasury is going to have an even greater number of delinquencies this year than heretofore expected. In order to avoid a muddle over taxes, therefore, many congressmen have suddenly decided that pay-as-you-go has got to be given priority over all other pending legislation. Members of the House Ways and Means Committee are now considering a plan to separate pay-as-you-go from other taxation measures and rush it through Congress as quickly as possible. Other legislation due to receive priority has to do with the 48-hour week. Senator Reed of Kansas, with strong Republican backing, has just presented a resolution to repeal the wage and hour law and return to the 48-hour working week. Walter Reuter of the United Auto Workers is also advocating a 48-hour week, and so is Secretary of Labor Perkins, but with a difference. Mr. Reuter would retain the wage and hour law and guarantee 48 hours of employment every week to every worker. There's no fresh news about the Pennsylvania strike, which will be over tomorrow. There was a communique at 1 o'clock. It reports continued American bombings of the enemy airdrome at Munda in the Solomons and another Japanese bombing of our own positions on Guadalcanal. Some casualties were suffered among our troops, the Navy says, but material damage was slight, and our troops continue to advance despite the stiffening enemy resistance. I now return you to CBS New York and John Daly.
And now Admiral Radio brings you Columbia's military expert, Major George Fielding Elliott.
The British Eighth Army has struck boldly and apparently with great power in the direction of the Axis base at Tripoli. Abandoning the coastal road and its difficult salt marshes, General Montgomery has made a wide sweep through the open desert and is reported only 110 miles from Tripoli. Such a move indicates that Montgomery is satisfied that he is well superior in mobile fighting power, especially armored power, to any opposition that the depleted forces of Marshal Rommel can offer. Montgomery is a hard-headed, tough soldier who does not take reckless chances. His drive for Tripoli bypasses the German position at Misurata, which will be hopelessly isolated if Montgomery reaches the coast at Tripoli or anywhere between Tripoli and Misurata. This means that Misurata will probably fall into British hands and will then form an excellent advance base for the British, as is the first good harbor west, that is, the first point at which the British Navy could resume its work of supplying Montgomery's army on a large scale. Hence, Montgomery must have collected the supplies and equipment needed for his present push by using the long, weary desert road from Cyrenaica, and this accounts for the long pause in his operations. Meanwhile, the Allied air forces at the port of Tripoli, which has made it difficult for Rommel to build up his own strength through that harbor.
And now Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
These next few seconds might be used in describing the new Admiral radios to be made after peace has come. But right now, all Admiral facilities are devoted to producing radio equipment for America's war effort, most of it under direct supervision of the Army Signal Corps. And Admiral would like to pass along a little of the respect it feels for this great branch of our fighting forces. The United States Army has the finest communications equipment in the world, not by accident, but because the Army Signal Corps has worked night and day through peace and war to devise, invent, and improve communications equipment. The search for better signal equipment started with the first Chief Signal Officer America had, Albert Meyer, who devised wigwag communication. And the search still goes on. Every piece of equipment accepted must be better than the piece which went before. Small wonder, then, that Admiral considers it a privilege to work with the Army Signal Corps. For Admiral has always had that same aim, to make better and better radio equipment. An aim which will continue after the smoke of battle is cleared, when Admiral will again produce fine radios for American homes. Admiral Radios, America's smart set. A 2-cent bullet can stop a Nazi in his tracks. So how about buying a few bullets for our boys to shoot? 5 for a 10-cent war stamp. And those war stamps will fill that stamp book you started and forgot. Fill it. Change it for an interest-bearing war bond. Come on, America. There's 100 million partially filled stamp books lying around. Let's fill them completely this week. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave direct from the leading news centers of the world. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Our next news broadcast will be at 4:45 this afternoon. This is the WBBM Air Theater, your station in the Wrigley Building, Chicago.
World News Today, brought to you by the Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations, as well as leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefronts. But first, here's Doug Edwards.
The Allied Fifth Army in Italy has thrown back German counterattacks and has cut deeper into the enemy defense lines around Cassino, the strategic town guarding the road to Rome. In Russia, Soviet armies have smashed within striking distance of 3 German escape railroads, and the fall of Sarny in Old Poland appears imminent. British Mosquito bombers were over German targets again last night. And in the far Pacific, Marine jungle fighters on New Britain Island have made new gains in the face of strong Jap opposition. And now for our first news direct from overseas, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Algiers, Winston Burdett reporting. We regret that we are not able to make contact with Columbia's correspondent in North Africa. However, for home front news, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS Washington, Don Pryor reporting.
Congress goes back to work tomorrow. You can't escape the feeling that it's going to be a tremendously important session. Certainly it will be racked with controversy because all the pent-up wartime pressures of the nation will be focused on Capitol Hill. Here are some of the issues that are waiting to be solved. Taxes. A bill providing a little over $2 billion, 1/5 as much as the Treasury asked for, is awaiting action in the Senate. Subsidies. By February 17th, there will have to be a showdown on the whole question of using subsidies to hold down the prices of food. The argument was postponed a bit by stopgap legislation adopted just before Congress went home for the holidays. Wages. The Senate has passed and the House is all ready to act on legislation which will give the non-operating railroad employees an arbitrary 8 cents an hour increase in wages. And then there's the red-hot question of labor policy in general. The recent steel strike and the threatened railroad strike are certain to lead to demands for more stringent labor legislation. There will also have to be strong movement in favor of national service legislation, which in effect would be a labor draft. Last night, Major General Hershey of Selective Service announced that occupational deferments for men under 22, whether they're fathers or not, will be curtailed sharply after the 1st of next month. The War Mobilization Director Burns has announced the adoption of a uniform clause for war contracts to cover their termination. It's the first big step of the new Baruch organization in preparing for demobilization when the war is over. President Roosevelt's annual message is expected to go to Capitol Hill day after tomorrow, but we still don't know whether the president will deliver it in person. That's up to his personal physician, Rear Admiral McIntyre. I return you to Admiral Radio in New York.
More news in just a moment, but first here is Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
Here in America, when a man's work is done, he can sit leisurely by his radio, perhaps an Admiral radio, and listen with complete enjoyment to his favorite program. But not so with the oppressed peoples of Europe, with Pierre the Frenchman, for example, who lives under the heel of the Nazi boot. Pierre must wait for darkness. In the dead of night, he steals down into the cellar, through the secret door, and there he is, underground. That's where his radio is. There, underground, at the risk of his life, he gets information which tells him when the long-awaited invasion is coming, and how to aid by destroying enemy installations, rails, bridges, factories. Through radio, underground, the oppressed learn the truth, learn of the coming invasion that will crush the heart of the enemy. To coordinate an invasion from the sea, on land, in the air, and yes, even underground, it takes radio. Admiral Radio is proud to be part of the coming invasion, just as Admiral was proud in pre-war days of its leadership as the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonograph combinations with automatic record changers. The entire production facilities of Admiral's 2 great plants are devoted to victory. But Admiral gives you this assurance: when victory is ours, the skill and precision now going into weapons of war will be found in your new and better Admiral, America's Smart Set. Now, here once again is Doug Edwards.
Massive Russian spearheads are pushing steadily forward today against retreating German troops in the southwestern Ukraine and in Old Poland. Red armies have smashed to within striking distance of 3 German escape railroads. Pushing on rapidly from captured Ilintsi, 40 miles east of Zhemerinka, one of General Vatutin's spearheads has brought the Odessa to Warsaw Railroad under attack. The cutting of this vital line of communication would force the Germans in the south to depend on secondary long-way-around railroads through Romania. Another Red Army group is less than 11 miles northeast of the junction town of Miranovka on the Belayat-Sirkov to Smelia Railroad. And in addition, Vatutin's advance units have practically made the east-west railway from Smelia to the Odessa to Warsaw line useless. Red Army troops are only 11 miles north of this line, which is the main German escape route across the southern Ukraine. Meanwhile, General Konev is developing his drive from captured Kirovograd. He's smashing at the rear of the German forces in the Dnieper Bend and increasing the threat to Krivoy Rog and Nikopol, the iron, coal, and manganese centers in the southeast. Red Army observers report that roads in the captured Kirovograd area are covered with smashed enemy guns, lorries, and crippled automobiles. To the northwest, Soviet columns in Old Poland are reported 5 miles east of the town of Sarny, capture of which would cut a 4th vital rail line which links the German armies to the north and south. American and British troops in the Allied Fifth Army in Italy have beaten off German counterattacks and reached a point within 4 miles of Cassino, the important town which guards the road to Rome. Reports from the front say terrific mountain battles are now underway, battles unlike anything seen in this war since the Greeks fought Italians in Albania 2 years ago. American troops fighting with bayonets and hand grenades pushed the Germans out of their strong positions in the village of Justo, and they've now driven into the heights closer to Cassino. Allied planes continue to hammer the continent. For this news and an interview with one of our fighting men, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS London. Larry LeSueur reporting.
In the past few months, this great aircraft carrier called Britain has become a concentration point for the fighting men of the United Nations. Sunburned men who conquered Africa confer over the map of Europe with those who drove out the Japs from the Aleutians. And here's a man who has seen the war in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. 32-year-old Colonel William J. Cummings of Lawrence, Kansas. He's better known to his boys in the 8th Air Force Fighter Command as Wild Bill Cummings when he leads his Thunderbolt group over Europe. Cummings now escorts our liberators and fortresses to Germany in daylight. But not so long ago, he was fighting Japanese Zeros in the Pacific. Colonel Cummings, which do you consider the toughest theater of war, the Atlantic or the Pacific?
Well, as an airman, there's not much doubt that the war is tougher here in Europe than it was out in the Pacific. The German planes are just as good, if not better, than the old Jap Zero, and I think the German pilot is more resolute. The Jap fights very hard on the ground, but in the air, the Jap will bluff out just as soon as anyone else.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. But, Colonel Cummings, I understand that although you're a fighter pilot, you've also fought on the ground against the Japs. How was that?
Well, you remember when the Japs attacked the Philippines, we were pretty short of planes. By the time we were driven to Bataan, we only had a few left. We kept passing them and shelling back and forth a minute an hour, bringing in supplies and ammunition. After a while, all our planes were out of action, and my squadron became infantrymen. We had rifles and pistols, and we fought skirmishes with the Jap infantry closing in on our soldiers in Bataan. Things went from bad to worse. Everybody had malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever. Then one day a liberator came in from Australia, and 35 of us piled into it, and we flew to safety on the mainland.
You were one of the lucky ones, weren't you? How many of your squadron got out of there, Colonel Cummings?
Just 9 out of the original 40. The rest of my friends are dead or prisoners of war. Some were killed on the ground, some were hit by bombs, some were shot down, and the rest are in prison camps.
Did you get any rest after that experience, Colonel Cummings?
Yes, after making a few missions over New Guinea against Japanese Zeros, I went back to America. Joined a new fighter squadron and sent me over here.
Well, where would you rather be, here or in the Pacific? Living conditions are better over here, aren't they?
Yes, they are, except for the cold.
Well, how about food? That's better over here, isn't it, Colonel Cummings?
Well, on Bataan, we had 2 meals a day, rice and sometimes a little canned salmon. Over here, it's spam and Brussels sprouts.
Well, I guess you'd settle for a steak and French fried.
Sure would, Larry. But when this is over, I want to get back and fight the Japs. After you've been strafed and bombed and seen your friends die alongside of you, war becomes very personal. I left a lot of good friends back there.
Yes, I guess the war is more impersonal for our boys here in Europe. Most of them have never seen a German. They've never seen the cities their bombs destroy. Have you ever been in Europe yourself, Colonel Cummings?
No, I never have, but I don't think it'll be long now. Germans almost in the same position as we were in the Pacific 2 years ago. They're on the defensive.
Yep, I guess they are, and I hope they'll keep them on the defensive for a long, long time. Thank you very much, Colonel Cummings. We return you now to CBS, New York.
Here at home, our Army Air Force mechanics are now inspecting a captured German medium bomber, the famed Junker 88. For a report on just how this ship stacks up against our planes, Admiral Radio takes you to Wright Field. Bill Slocum, Jr. reporting.
Sitting here on the flight line at Wright Field is an interesting testimony to our Russian allies' powers of persuasion. It is a Ju-88, a German twin-engine airplane that not too long ago sat on a flight line somewhere in Romania. A young Nazi aviator owned that Ju-88, and after giving much thought to the certain basic inconsistencies of the master race doctrine, he came to a decision, which was in effect nuts to this. He therefore promptly climbed into his plane and flew to Allied territory, surrendering himself and his plane intact. Being a very observing young Nazi, he was smart enough to surrender to the British, even though they were farther away than the Russians. This plane is now at Wright Field, headquarters of the Air Force's Materiel Command, where daring young American test pilots are learning exactly what makes it click. It is long and anemic-looking except for its head, which is fairly large. It looks like a garden snake trying to swallow a golf ball. 3 or 4 Germans get into that bulbous nose up front, but it's a cinch 2 of them must be junior Germans. Captain Gus Lundquist, a young man from Chicago, has, with several other test pilots at Wright Field, been flying this plane. The captain's passion for the Ju-88 is somewhat restrained, but he did consent to talk about it with me today. Captain, what do you think of it?
Confidentially, Mr. Slocum, it isn't a very good airplane. As an all-purpose plane, it's good. It can be used as a bomber, fighter, a reconnaissance job, or a dive bomber. But, and this is the important but, she isn't any too good in any one phase of the different types of...
How about the gadgets on her, Captain?
She carries good instruments and a couple of buttons that are something. One button, when pushed, sets off a charge that destroys the bomb bay mechanism.
How'd you find out about that button?
The hard way, Mr. Slocum. We pushed it. One of the boys got hurt a little bit.
How about the other button?
That blows off the entire tail assembly. We discovered that right after we found out about the bomb bays, but not by pushing anything, so the tail's still on.
What do we have that's like the Ju-88?
Our A-20 is something like her, but the A-20 is faster, better armed and armored, and carries more bombs. Anything that junkers can do, we have one or more planes that can do it better.
You and the Nazi pilot who surrendered her seem to have basically the same opinions of the 88. Could you say a kind word about her at all?
Well, Mr. Slocum, she flew across the Atlantic.
And that is a thought, Captain Lundquist. Thanks for helping us give a picture of the German Ju-88, now close to obsolescence. But as any merchant mariner or Navy man can tell you, she was a great gal when she had it, and she really had it. Now back to Admiral Radio in New York.
This week, the Germans made little effort to minimize the disaster of facing their troops in Russia and their troubles at home. For a direct report from one of Europe's listening posts, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Madrid. Glenn Stadler reporting.
As Nazi Marshal Rommel ranged up and down the Channel coast checking his anti-invasion preparations, all of Europe, and especially Holland, Belgium, and France, became visibly more restless. This condition is everywhere reflected in the German-controlled newspapers. Notices of executions of patriots are increasing daily. A typical one from Le Journal of Lyon announces that 3 Frenchmen were shot by a Gestapo firing squad on December 28th. The charge was favoring the enemy. But despite reprisals and 3,000 arrests each week in France alone, anti-Nazi groups become larger, better organized, and more daring. In Valenciennes, a dozen armed men led by a man brandishing a gun in each hand broke into the jail, took 50,000 francs, and liberated 5 companions. In a running gun battle, one was killed. The others escaped, some on bicycles. Thus, having failed to quell resistance, the Nazis have reverted again to what they must think is a clever trick, but has had little or no success. It's a periodic appeal to surrender firearms and promises immunity from punishment, even though possession of guns and explosives is illegal. The catch is, of course, that the minute someone is foolish enough to comply, he's arrested. Yes, they promise immunity, but only for the period specified. The person is guilty of having the arms in the previous overlapping period covered by an identical law prescribing the death penalty. German papers carry none of this type of news because the propaganda ministry believes that people might get the wrong idea about life in the occupied countries. Hitler's own Völkischer Beobachter features blasts at the Allies and laboriously written explanations on why the Red Army is in Poland now. The Nazi journals, however, do carry hundreds of death notices daily, and there obviously is a large backlog because many are dated as of 6 months ago. One recently announced the death on the Russian front of a soldier named John Dillinger. Another, in black border and big type, bore only the name Adolf. This is Glenn Stadler in Madrid, returning you to Admiral Radio in New York.
Our Pacific forces continue to strike hard at the enemy in the central and southern area. For a summary of the latest developments in that war zone, Admiral Radio takes you after a brief pause to CBS Pearl Harbor. Webley Edwards reporting.
In the Pacific, United States Marines on New Britain have pushed a mile and 3/4 south of Silimati Point. There's heavy fighting. Rabaul has been raided for the 6th time in 6 days. Australians are driving up the Hawaiian Peninsula and are close to a juncture with United States forces who last week landed at Sidor. The marshals have been bombed again. I'm now able to tell you that I have just spent some time with the Marines of Tarawa. Earlier, I flew to a Pacific island and, to my surprise, landed squarely in the midst of them, just as their convoys were arriving. I say to my surprise because outside of official circles, nobody knew where they were, and there'd been considerable speculation as to where the Marines would be taken for rest and rehabilitation after their occupation of Tarawa. That arrival of the Marines, back from one of the grimmest, bloodiest actions of all the history of this fighting corps, was one of the most impressive things I've ever seen. They came off their troop ships in every stage of disarray. They still wore their mottled camouflage fighting outfits, those who still had them, but many were in shorts and old suits of underwear, and some wore improvised wraparounds. They brought much of their equipment back with them, and it had the look of well-worn battle gear. Only equipment that's been in real fighting can have quite that appearance. They had some of their wounded with them, and some who had died on the way home. They were tough, hard-bitten, and soberly serious. They were men who'd learned about war at Guadalcanal before they found out about hell at Tarawa. And yet, being Marines, there was a jauntiness about them that even their disheveled clothing could not hide. This was no gala landing, nor was there any of the spick-and-span parade ground stuff about this homecoming. But even so, as they poured down the gangways and stepped again on solid earth, the Marines raised their heads and straightened their shoulders and looked you square in the eye as if to say, well, that was that. They had trophies, naturally, bundles of Jap paper, money, Jap flags, and all the dozens of things that fighting men pick up on battlefields to take back to the girlfriend of the family. They went to a plain in a higher region of the island and set about making themselves a great camp. It's a real undertaking to set up a camp for as many men as they had and do it from the ground up, but they thought nothing of it. They're there now, getting some rest. They are restless, though, and I think they would welcome action at once if they could get it. When you have seen the Marines back from Tarawa, it makes you glad they are on our side. It would be very unpleasant to have to meet these Marines in battle anywhere. This is Webley Edwards at Pearl Harbor, returning you to Admiral Radio in New York.
Two Army nurses who helped care for our wounded soldiers in the South Pacific are now back in this country. For their story, Admiral Radio again takes you to CBS Washington, Don Pryor reporting.
I met a couple of girls yesterday out at the Army's Walter Reed General Hospital. They had a story to tell, so here they are. They are Lieutenant Marguerite Cooney of Worcester, Massachusetts, and Lieutenant Helen Burns of Wallingford, Connecticut, both Army nurses. They just got back to the States after 22 months abroad. How'd you happen to get in the Army, girls?
We both joined through the Red Cross in 1940. We volunteered for 1 year.
That was Lieutenant Burns. You say you volunteered for 1 year, but it's well over 3 years now.
Well, the war changed things. We got our orders to sail right after Pearl Harbor, January 1942.
Well, did you know where you were going? Incidentally, that was Lieutenant Cooney that time.
No, we didn't know.
Well, most of us guessed that we were going to Australia. That seemed like the most logical place.
And you were right?
Yes, but we only stayed there a week, and then we went to New Caledonia.
Had you ever heard of New Caledonia before?
No, we didn't know there was such a place in the world until we set foot in it.
Was it exciting after you got there?
It was at first. We were expecting trouble when we landed. We went ashore in fatigue uniforms with tin helmets and everything. But nothing happened.
Where were you? In a city?
I wouldn't call it that. We were in Noumea for a while. That's the biggest town on the island, but it's just a dirty little village.
We stayed there a few weeks, though, and then our whole outfit moved to 120 miles north.
And that was some ride. It took us 10 hours in a truck.
Where was that? What town?
No town at all. We were right out in the woods.
How about living accommodations?
We lived in tents for 8 months.
Our hospital was a tent, too.
And we had to carry all our water from a brook.
We bathed in the brook, too, and we had a little pool there screened off with tenting.
Sort of rugged, but it does sound like fun.
It was. But, of course, we got pretty homesick now and then.
After the first 8 months, we got the natives to build us some grass houses. You could have a house built for about $25.
They were all right, too, until I got too full of rats and mice and things.
Did you handle very many casualties?
Not for quite a while. Finally, all the boys who were with us at first were sent to Guadalcanal.
But we had plenty of casualties later. After 14 months, we moved again, not far from Noumea. We received many from the New Georgia and Russell Islands.
Were they good patients, mostly?
Most of them were very good and very appreciated.
Speaking of getting back in the States now, after 22 months, how did it feel to get back?
Wonderful. It's funny how the little things impress you most, like bathtubs and being able to walk into a store and buy something. But the thing that surprised me most was the fact that rationing wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it would be. My friends had written about how terrible the shortages were.
And how about you, Lieutenant Cooney? What impressed you most?
Women running streetcars, buses, and so many of them in work clothes. I'd heard about all those things, but I really wasn't prepared for it.
Do you want to go back out there?
Yes, I do. I was terribly anxious to get back here, but now I feel kind of restless and lost. I suppose I'll get used to it after a while.
Yes, I suppose you will after a while. That was Lieutenant Marguerite Cooney and Lieutenant Helen Burns, Army nurses just back from the South Pacific. I return you to Admiral Radio in New York.
The Chungking Radio has broadcast a note to Jap Premier Tojo to keep him up to date on the latest figures on American airplane production. Dear Tojo, the broadcast said, for your information, for your further information, The United States produced a bombing plane every 4 minutes, every day, 24 hours a day during December. And then the broadcast gave the figures. A record number of 8,800 planes in December to bring the American total for the year to almost 86,000 planes. The Chinese broadcast concluded. Start counting, Tojo. And now, once again, here is Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
Does your radio give you the same flawless reception and carefree enjoyment it did when new? If not, the trouble may be some easily made adjustment that you can do yourself. To conserve your busy Admiral dealer's time, Admiral has prepared a clearly illustrated home checkup chart showing you how to correct minor difficulties in reception. For example, here is one of the 20 suggestions made. Make sure your antenna lead-in wire hasn't become frayed by rubbing. The exposed wire, when wet by rain, sleet, or snow and blown against the building, may be grounded in poor reception results. The Admiral Home Checkup Chart is designed purely as an aid and time saver for your Admiral dealer and will not help you to correct major troubles or structural failures. Your Admiral dealer is the man to call in such cases because of his knowledge and equipment. But for your copy of the Admiral Home Checkup Chart, ask your dealer or address a card or letter to Admiral Radio in care of this station. Thanks to huge increases in farm production, America has enough food to satisfy the basic requirements of good health and sound nutrition and still meet the food demands of war. But we do not have all the food we want and can afford. Rationing is the democratic way to share and share alike. It is a vital wartime necessity, but rationing is not enough. Prices must be kept from skyrocketing. Black markets must be stamped out. 15 million Americans have signed the Home Front Pledge, which is, I will pay no more than top legal prices. I will not accept rationed goods without giving up ration points. Living up to this pledge will assure a fair share for all. And that's the right way, the democratic way. Remember, food fights for freedom. The appearance of Army personnel on this program does not constitute an endorsement of our product by the Army, as the Army does not endorse any product. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by the Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from leading news centers of the world. This is Warren Sweeney speaking coast to coast for the Admiral Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The WBBM Air Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago 11.
World News Today, brought to you by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas capitals, as well as the leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefronts. But first, here's John Daly.
On all the far-flung battlefronts of this war, initiative from the Axis powers. Land forces of the United Nations no longer dive instinctively for the foxholes when planes roar overhead, for most of them are Allied planes. This single factor, perhaps more than any other, has put the United Nations on the offensive. In North Africa, in both Libya and Tunisia, the story of the fighting is principally the story of air fighting, of Allied planes methodically hammering at Axis supply ports and Axis supply lines. American bombers from Tunisia have made their first attack on the Axis-held area of Tripoli in Libya today. They bombed an airfield 10 miles west of the enemy base and scored direct hits. That pays back the British Eighth Army in Libya for some of the attacks it has been making on Axis bases in Tunisia. It also reveals again the cooperation between the Allied forces in the east and west. Both, of course, are working with a common objective, to drive the Axis from all North Africa, and first, to drive them from the air. Allied air power in the last few days also has won and is still winning important decisions in the Pacific. And for a report direct from that area, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS Honolulu, Webley Edwards reporting.
This is Honolulu. The mopping up on the Papua Peninsula of New Guinea has forced the Jap back some 150 miles to his bases at Lae and Salamaua. This, however, is not so much of a retreat by him as it is a nipping off and destroying of his advanced base by the Allied forces. There were hardly any survivors to retreat. In a broader sense, the Japs have not even started the retreat in the Pacific. They've been stopped, yet even now they're preparing to strike again.
Latest reports are that our planes carried out a continuous night and day attack on a Jap convoy in the Huon Gulf area of northeastern New Guinea, hitting 2 transports, one of which was burning, the other beached, shooting down or destroying on the ground 43 fighter planes, damaging a bomber and 6 fighters. In addition, probably shooting 17 other Jap fighters out of the sky. Also, an additional 7 out of 15 Jap fighter planes that attacked our planes on a return flight from bombing a Jap airdrome at Madang. But reinforcements were believed landed by the Japs in the Huon Gulf area. In the Solomons, at Guadalcanal, American forces hold their precious ground and its priceless airfield. Land fighting continues, but patrol action. Up north, at the other end of the vast Pacific front, the action is by sea and air, rather by land. The picture out here, then, is one of continuous bombing by air of Jap bases by our forces. Bombing that also extends into the reaches of the sea, seeking out Jap transports carrying reinforcement troops for New Guinea and the Solomons. Despite our sinking of substantial portions of his convoys and the probable death of thousands of Jap troops aboard, the enemy is believed to have been able to strengthen his forces, protecting his airfields in the New Guinea, at Rabaul and New Britain, and the Reykjavik Bay areas in Santa Isabel of the Solomons. Some of us out here consider the optimistic statement of Admiral William F. Halsey as probably the most un-Halsey-like statement that great fighter ever made. He predicted complete, absolute defeat for the Axis powers, specifically including Japan, in this coming year. That is a large order, even for so great and successful a fighter as Admiral Halsey. If he can justify it, then he has information that many of the rest of us out here would like to have. There's only one reporter speaking, but one who's talked to many men who've been fighting and who've been observing on the long line from the Aleutians to New Guinea. Almost to a man, they predict a long war out here. They resign to a holding war with offensive, yes, but still a war of holding until the European deal is closed, and then still a long, hard battle before we give our men liberty in the city of Tokyo. Meanwhile, they're fighting fiercely in the most difficult theater of war with tremendous courage and inspiring success. This is Webley Edwards speaking from Pearl Harbor. We return you to CBS in New York.
And now, before we get more reports from CBS correspondents abroad, here is Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
Wherever America's fighting sons are serving, whether as advanced scouts on the desert wastes of Africa or as snipers in the foxholes of the Solomons, one ever-faithful friend is always at their side. That friend is their radio, built by Admiral. America's fighting sons spent many happy hours listening to their Admiral radio in the living room back home. Now they find it's an Admiral-built radio that fights with them on the field of battle. And the meeting of so dependable an old friend out there is a heart-warming experience. Knowing this, knowing the confidence these fighting men have in Admiral, inspires every worker in Admiral's 2 great plants with a desire to produce the best radio equipment possible as fast as possible. And all they produce goes to help America's armed services attain victory. When victory is won, Admiral will again build fine radios and radio phonograph combinations for home use, and thus serve these fighting sons a 3rd time. For as victors, they will want to take into their own homes the familiar friend of pre-war days, the dependable partner of the battlefield. A radio built by Admiral, the only radio known as America's Smart Set. Now, here again is John Daly.
And now, across the Atlantic for the news of European developments, Admiral Radio turns now to CBS London. Bob Trout reporting.
In London, for some weeks, war correspondents who specialize in reporting air operations have been arguing about the absence of an all-out air offensive against the Germans on the continent during the past 2 months. Some say the comparative lull has been due to Allied operations on other fronts, which required planes that would otherwise have gone to Royal Air Force's Bomber Command on this island. Others insist it's just been the weather. But the lull has been only comparative. Last night's Royal Air Force attack on targets in the German city of Essen was the 5th raid on the Ruhr in 7 nights. 7 bombers are missing from this raid and mine-laying operations. The Air Ministry says good results from the British 4,000-pound bombs were seen at Essen. The weather over the targets was clear last night. While we cannot give weather details in wartime, everyone knows that Britain's weather has little in common with the weather in many American areas where new United States Army pilots are taught to fly. British fogs and rain are as much of a military factor as Tunisia's mud. Today, the London Sunday Express's columnist, Nat Gubbins, says only the British could survive food and fuel rationing and a wet northeast wind. The Huns, he says, might stand 2 winters in Russia, but I doubt if they'd stand 1 in England. Today's German High Command communique was read with some interest in London, where it was noticed that the German communique today speaks of the German garrison at Veliki Luki heroically resisting strong Russian attacks. For days, the Germans have been keeping up the pretense that they still hold Veliki Luki, possibly counting on recapturing this strong point and then claiming that they had never lost it. Perhaps that word heroically in today's communique means the German High Command is losing hope of recapturing Veliki Luki. For the last time a German communique spoke of Germans fighting heroically was in making a half-hearted admission of the Russian breakthrough on the Middle Don front. Also in today's German communique, all the fighting on what the German High Command yesterday so vaguely described as the Don region and between the Don and the Caucasus is now described as the defense battle in the south. This is said to be going on with unabated violence, all Russian attacks having been repelled. Britain's Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, today made a speech at Newcastle dealing with the post-war future of the British Commonwealth. I want it to last, he said, not because it's British, but because it's good and will be better yet. Without it, the world would lose a great factor of stability and progress just when those things are most needed. Mr. Morrison said, it's not enough for our friends or critics abroad to pay lip service to the self-governing empire. It's necessary that they understand it. Other people may think there must be a catch in it somewhere. Well, there is no catch. The freedom and independence of the dominions are real. The proof is Eire, Southern Ireland, which decided to stay out of the war and was left free to do so to the great hurt of the empire's cause and with little advantage to her reputation. Britain's Home Secretary had something to say about worldwide peace and worldwide security, not just freedom from want and freedom from fear in Britain alone. And he had a good deal to say about the future of the empire's colonies, those territories which have not yet attained the status of dominions. It's impossible to cover, in this report, the points which Herbert Morrison covered or touched on. I suggest that you read the speech, not because you'll necessarily like it, but as long as this transatlantic controversy is going on, the criticisms might just as well be based on the facts. If there has to be an argument, it always helps a little when both sides talk about the same thing. London has reports from the Middle East of increasingly heavy blows by Allied air forces against the enemy in North Africa. Especially in the past 48 hours, the range and number of Royal Air Force night operations have been increased. And Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Force bombers coming from east and west have now met for the first time in a sort of air pincers attack on the German bases in Tripolitania. Next to CBS Cairo and the report of Columbia's correspondent in Cairo.
Mr. Morrison in Cairo. Nothing you would call news is coming through the evil weather that now blankets the front in Libya. But the front that 10 weeks ago was 150 miles from Cairo is now 1,500 miles away, and getting there is proportionately difficult. Let me tell you instead what goes on here. A year ago, an American in this city was almost a rarity. Now even the shoeshine boys have learned to spot American insignia and even to identify an American in civilian clothes. The other night in the lobby of Shepherd's Hotel, I heard the unmistakable accent of Indiana cutting through the murmur of lobby conversation. It was the voice of an American girl in the blue uniform of the Army nurses. Yes, I heard her say to an English captain, yes, I know, I'm a pretty girl, but right now I'm hungry. And what are we going to do about that? I see Americans everywhere now, all of them doing something, all learning the terrible importance of this front. And as I watch them, I think that perhaps the reason the shoeshine boys can spot them is their air of brisk freshness. Listening to my countrymen here is like attending a continuous performance of Gone with the Wind. So many of them are from the South. But today I was talking to a Yankee from Cambridge, Massachusetts. He told me the leaves turned red and yellow last fall as though nothing were more important. He said there was snow now in the little street, and that the subway fare to Boston is still a dime. And as we talked, I remembered a Yorkshireman. He told me the leaves turned red and yellow last fall, as though nothing were more important. He said there was snow now in the little street, and that the subway fare to Boston is still a dime. And as we talked, I remembered a Yorkshireman who told me all one night about his own village of Putsey, and I realized that there must be thousands of conversations like this. People here don't talk about war. War to us has become not a crusade, but a job to be finished. People here talk about home and about tomorrow. They have ideas about the world tomorrow, and if the ideas crystallize and have effect, tomorrow's will be a better world. This is Chester Morrison returning you to CBS New York.
That was Chester Morrison of the Chicago Sun reporting from Cairo. 1,500 miles to the north in Russia, the Red Army is still advancing, but the midday communique from Moscow makes it clear that the Nazis are counterattacking desperately. So far, the counterattacks seem to have done little good, since even the German communique claims only that the Nazi armies are fighting defensively. On the other hand, the Russian noon communique said that the Red Army had occupied 30 inhabited localities in the Caucasus region, and press dispatches indicate that the important Nazi-held railway junction, Georgievsk, is practically surrounded with Russian troops within 10 miles of the city. In the Don area, where the Nazi counterattacks were the heaviest, the Russians claimed new gains and said the Germans suffered a serious defeat and heavy losses of equipment. Thus, at week's beginning, with at least 5 Red Armies driving directly or indirectly on Rostov, the Russians appear to have a reasonable chance to cut off the Axis armies in the Caucasus. Next, to our own hemisphere for news from Latin America. Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS Chile. Charles Griffin reporting.
The resolution will come. It is expected toward the end of next week or soon afterwards, when the Senate is informed of the latest developments by means of exposition, to be read out on Tuesday the 12th by the Foreign Minister. The Minister of Interior, Senor Raul Morales, delivered a report of his recently completed official mission to the United States last night, and President Rios, accompanied by Foreign Minister Senor Joaquin Fernandez and a number of experts, is devoting the weekend in his summer residence at Viña del Mar to give the finishing touches to the proposal for an early break-off with the Axis, it is affirmed. The Foreign Minister denied the report that the Presidents of Chile and Argentina contemplated meeting soon on the border.
That was Charles Griffin reporting from Chile. One of Columbia's reporters is today in one of the famous bombers that gave Tokyo the first taste of American bombs. Admiral Radio switches now to a microphone aboard a B-25 somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, and Bill Slocum, Jr., ready to report from one of America's most efficient fighting weapons.
Dead is purely coincidental, because I am now laying on my stomach in a B-25, a vicious piece of fighting machinery built to carry bombs and more bombs and a minimum of human cargo. This B-25 is the same model that Jimmy Doolittle and some other ambitious young Americans took off from Shangri-La for a little bombing job in and around Tokyo. The B-25 is also the ship that is making clay pigeons out of Axis boats and supply depots in North Africa. It is really quite a ship, and restrictions permitting, I'd like to tell you how this dynamite-spitting gadget works. It's a 2-motor job, and it carries, in addition to bombs, heavy and well-distributed machine gun emplacements. Its normal crew consists of 6 men, but if Shangri-La happens to be some distance away, it can function with fewer. At the controls of this B-25 is Lieutenant J.B. Richard of Great Neck, Long Island, a schoolmate of mine and once something of the town's problem child. Today, he's operations officer at Southeast Training Center of the Flying Training Command's Tyndall Field, and a very serious young man indeed. Lieutenant Richard, you've been pointing my ear about B-25s for 2 days now. Would you repeat some of that briefly for the listeners?
The B-25 is a great bombing instrument because it's capable of carrying a heavy load and still move fast enough to keep fighter planes at a respectable distance. There's plenty of machine gun protection, too. It's a trifle hot when she lands, but if you attend to your business, you won't have much trouble getting her in.
Thank you, Lieutenant Richard. A little hot is pilot's terminology for a plane that lands with great speed, and the B-25 does that, just as it does everything else, with high speed. The B-25 is a big airplane, although it is called a medium bomber. It permits its crew all the freedom of movement they would have, all 6 of them in a telephone booth. It is a compact instrument of war, and unless you want to wriggle along in your stomach, you stay put once you get in. Before me are a pilot and a co-pilot. In front of them, down in the nose, is a bombardier. Behind me, sitting on a tiny stool, is a navigator, and next to him, a very grim young man who handles a very potent piece of machine gun gear. There's another gun farther back. There are gadgets everywhere. I can't tell you much about them because, A, I don't know anything about them, and B, I wouldn't be let talk about them if I knew. But I do know American ingenuity has poured steel, aluminum, cloth, and dynamite into a piece of fighting machinery which, when mixed with the courage and brains of American airmen, should go a long way toward shortening up this war. And Tokyo air wardens will be unhappy to learn that we are not faced with any shortage of B-25s at the moment. I return you to CBS in New York and John Daly.
Now, for the news at home, Admiral Radio takes you next to CBS Washington, Lee White reporting.
Washington this week has come to a sort of turning point. Except for the rumpus over Ed Flynn's hopes of becoming a diplomat after resigning as chairman of the Democratic National Committee, there's no immediate cause for bickering between the administration and its opponents. There's the question of post-war planning, of course. In his speech last Wednesday, the president said he thought it within the realm of possibility that the 78th Congress would be called upon to formulate a peace. Yesterday, the dominant isolationist member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Mr. Nye, said he thought the New Deal's peace plans were doomed to failure, just as were those of Wilson. But he added that he and his Republican colleagues would have no objection to discussing peace plans calmly with their Democratic opponents, even while the war is going on. In Congress last Wednesday, I watched the reactions of certain legislators to Mr. Roosevelt's speech. Hamilton Fish and Arthur Vandenberg never once applauded, except when Mr. Roosevelt left the House. But Gerald Nye applauded every time the president mentioned disarmament or peace, except on one occasion when the phrase was durable peace. In general, the president's speech was well received, though the applause, I noticed, was rather milder from the Republican wing than those who heard the speech over the radio may have thought. Even Republicans, however, accepted the speech as a conciliatory gesture on the part of Mr. Roosevelt. And it was conciliatory, except on one specific point, expansion of Social Security after the war. Here the president, in saying, "I dissent," made it very clear that in the 2 years remaining to the administration, he would do everything in his power to impress on Congress what he considers its obligation to our fighting men, to assure them of the third freedom, freedom from want, by means of permanent unemployment insurance and free hospital and medical care for those who require it. At his White House conference on Friday, the president was asked if he anticipated much debate on Senator Wagner's pending Social Security bill. He said he didn't, and explained that he felt the differences at the moment are based on methods of attaining Social Security rather than the principle that Social Security is a good and necessary thing. Tomorrow, the Congress will receive the president's budget message for the fiscal year beginning on the 1st of next July. Mr. Roosevelt is expected to request appropriations of more than $100 billion, mostly for war expenditures, and Congress is expected to give his text a very critical appraisal. Most of our legislators are dead set against spending a cent more than is necessary, even for airplanes, but our legislators are not expected to quibble over the direct costs of the war. They may argue over some of the president's views, for his budget message is expected to be couched in far more specific, stronger terminology than his address on the state of the nation. But they won't even have much of an opportunity to fight over income taxes, for the president has anticipated their temper and has already gone on record in favor of pay-as-you-go. Though he still supports Mr. Morgenthau and others at the Treasury in their opposition to the Rummel Plan, so-called, neither he nor Mr. Morgenthau any longer oppose pay-as-you-go in principle. So it's almost certain that Congress will shortly pass the Rummel Plan or something very like it, no matter what it's called, and with a very substantial majority. There will be very little debate in Congress. But one thing people ought to understand is this. Pay-as-you-go isn't going to save anybody any money. It will merely ensure that taxes are paid on time. A Navy communique just released announces 2 more raids on the Japanese airfield at Munda on New Georgia Island, but apparently with no great results. We now return you to CBS in New York.
Returning for a moment to the air war in Tunisia, back in this country after serving on the North African front, Brigadier General Stuart C. Godfrey of the Aviation Engineers has an interesting story of methods of building advanced air bases almost overnight. Godfrey says when it became necessary to establish advanced bases to support the action in Tunisia, a call was put in for airborne engineers. With their equipment, they were flown in cargo planes to points as close as possible to the selected sites. Within 3 days, flying fortresses were taking off from the first base, and a second base was completed on the next day. And now, Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
As you know, point rationing will soon go into effect. The government is doing much to help you understand how it works, giving you daily information by means of radio programs. All you need do is listen, and, of course, keep your radio in good operating order. This last is a job which had better be turned over to your Admiral dealer. It's almost impossible to buy a new radio, and even some parts are difficult to replace these days. So don't let an inexperienced person service a radio you own. Your Admiral dealer can put almost any set in perfect condition, quickly and economically, because he has the right tools, the facilities, and years of experience. Admiral dealers consider it a patriotic duty to help keep America's radios in tip-top shape, just as Admiral considered it a patriotic duty to turn both great Admiral plants to war production, the same plants which made Admiral in peacetime the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonograph combinations with automatic record changers. So call your Admiral dealer for radio service. Be sure your set is in the hands of an expert. When you buy war bonds and stamps, you're protecting your future in 2 ways. First, war bonds and stamps ensure the freedoms and liberties American citizens have always enjoyed. Second, you're saving for a rainy day or for the luxuries you'll be able to have after victory is won. For logical reasons, invest 10% of your earnings in U.S. war bonds and stamps. Don't let yourself or Uncle Sam down. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from the leading news centers of the world. This is Warren Sweeney speaking for Admiral Radio. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Our next news broadcast will be heard at 4:45 this afternoon. This is the WBBM Air Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago.
World News Today, brought to you by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast direct from important overseas stations, as well as the leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefronts. But first, here's John Daly.
Heavy Allied air activity in Europe, in Africa, and in the Pacific is making secure the hard-won hold on the initiative that the United Nations have gained on all the fronts of this war. In French North Africa, the political situation has held the center of the stage. But every day, the military reports have told the story of Allied flyers pounding at the Axis supply ports and strafing and bombing Axis land communications. This is the all-important preliminary to any all-out land offensive. British planes bombed and machine-gunned enemy vehicles on the roads leading from the port of Sfax in Tunisia, and other Allied airmen continue to hammer at Axis targets around the clock. The raids were carried out by the new Bisley planes of the Royal Air Force. Meanwhile, French headquarters announced that French troops fighting northwest of Kairouan had seized several important points near Jebel de Babou. And now, for the news direct from French North Africa, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Algiers' Charles Collingwood reporting. We regret that due to transmission difficulties, we're not able to get the report from Charles Collingwood in Tunisia right now, So we turn to London for the report of a big air raid on Berlin. For the details, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS London, Bob Trout reporting.
London expects to get the details of last night's raid on Berlin sometime after midnight tonight, British time. So far, what we know about the Royal Air Force attack is that a strong force of heavy British bombers dropped a great weight of bombs on Berlin, and large fires were seen from the air. One bomber is missing from the strong force. Last night's was the 54th Royal Air Force raid on Berlin. The 53rd was made on a night in November of 1941. So, you see, Berlin went through the whole year of 1942 without a raid from the Royal Air Force, but the Russians were over Berlin a number of times. However, those early raids on Berlin were on a small scale, a very different operation from the kind that is now considered a normal raid, made on the principles of concentration and saturation of defenses, made with greater numbers of big four-engine bombers with their bombs of 4,000 pounds and 8,000 pounds. Those old raids were usually directed against single, important war targets. Railroad stations, for instance, factories and power plants. If British bombers fly the most direct route to Berlin from this country, they have to cover some 1,200 miles, much of the journey over enemy territory. When the Royal Air Force planes arrive at the German capital, they have to face very powerful defenses. Still, from last night's raid, only one British plane is missing. London was glad to get today's Cairo communique telling us of the opening of a new phase of the Battle of Tripolitania, but London was not surprised. Those strange German reports put out yesterday about fierce battles in which the Axis forces had stopped the Eighth Army bore a strong resemblance to those fake German reports which were put out back at El Agheila. This latest forward drive of the Eighth Army began at 7 o'clock Friday morning, and the latest reports in London are that the forward movement has been uninterrupted, and the British have advanced some 40 or 50 miles from Wadi Zemzem. A British correspondent at the front with General Montgomery's forces says that the start of the Eighth Army's new drive is the biggest moment since El Alamein. And now back to New York and John Daly.
More news in just a moment, but first here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
Several days ago, one of the CBS reporters heard on this program, Charles Collingwood, gave the world its first news of the French royalist plot to establish a monarchy in North Africa. Right now, you are listening to the dramatic story of history-making events. And in months to come, radio will give you every step in the complete defeat of the Axis. There's a story you won't want to miss. And the one way to make sure of hearing every single chapter is to take care of your radio, for you won't be able to get a new set until after the complete story is told. At present, your Admiral dealer can put almost any radio in perfect shape, regardless of make or condition. But as the weeks roll by, new parts will become increasingly difficult to obtain. So the wise man will call his Admiral dealer now and have minor adjustments made before vital parts are too far gone to be repaired. Remember, your radio set is a precious instrument, your only way of hearing the story of the battles as they are fought. And remember also, your Admiral dealer is the expert who will do everything possible to keep your radio in tip-top shape for the duration. Admiral dealers have the facilities, the knowledge, and the backing of Admiral, in peacetime, the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonograph combinations with automatic record changers. Now, here once again, for Admiral Radio, is John Daly.
Now for news of the situation along the Pacific war fronts, Admiral Radio takes you after a few seconds' pause to CBS Australia, William J. Dunn reporting.
Australia's eternal bugaboo, shortage of manpower, promises to become even more serious during the few months just ahead. Prime Minister Curtin's statement that at least another 210,000 persons will be needed for war work or active service within the next 6 months poses a situation which he himself described as of utmost gravity. 210,000 persons doesn't sound so large when considered in the light of America's population. But in a nation of 7 million, where more than 1 out of every 10 persons is wearing the uniform of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, or one of the women's auxiliaries, it's a staggering order. Actually, 210,000 Australians is a proportion equal of nearly 4 million Americans. And when America reaches its 4th year of war, 4 million able-bodied men and women not already working for the war effort will be hard to find. The Prime Minister is frank in his admission that the answer to this problem has not yet been found. But unless the answer is found, the probable alternatives are curtailment of war production or starving the services of reinforcements, he said. General Sir Thomas Blamey, commander of the Allied land forces in the Southwest Pacific area, in a radio talk to Australia a few hours ago, warned against any feeling that our signal success in Papua meant that the Japanese menace to Australia has ended. He praised the joint work of the American and Australian soldier in the Buna campaign, but predicted that Japan is still anxious to eliminate Australia as a possible Allied base from which a successful offensive might be launched. He pointed out that in New Guinea, the peril of tropical diseases was even more deadly than the menace of the Japanese. This is William J. Dunn in Australia. I return you to CBS in New York.
In the Far East, British bombers supporting the British drive in western Burma against Akyab successfully bombed targets on Akyab Island, and heavy bombers of the United States 10th Air Force left a 7,000-ton Jap cargo vessel sinking and another ship damaged in a Jap convoy south of Rangoon. Thus, new news of aerial activity in the Far East. Besides these major raids, today, Allied flyers, mostly fighters, dropped light bombs and machine gun Jap trains and coastal shipping. The ground forces are still fighting about 25 miles from Akyab. Once again, the reports, as in Europe, from the Far East are reports of air activity, of Allied efforts to smash at the enemy's communications, not only to smash at his principal bases of communication and supply, but also to cut into his equipment for the transport of those supplies. The news from Cairo this morning that the British 8th Army is again on the offensive is news that is good news because we've waited for it for several days. The latest dispatches say that the Allied forces have swept to within 110 miles of the Axis base of Tripoli. You remember that the British 8th Army struck Friday at 2 points, at the center of the Axis line and also at the Axis right flank. It skirted the impassable depression there and drove into the open desert where Rommel has little chance of digging in for another stand. Thus, the news of Montgomery's 8th Army once again in action, and it's news that ties in with the news of the French force that came up from the Lake Chad area in Africa and which for the past several weeks has been winning one battle after another. This French force is, of course, still several hundred miles south of Tripoli, still several hundred miles south of the flank of Rommel's army. But it's a factor that has to be considered in the fighting that is going on now in Tripolitania. How far the French force will be able to move without further supplies and perhaps without having to wait some time to pull up major supplies from its bases, no one as yet can tell. But it's very possible that the British 8th Army may find itself operating with a friend on its flank much sooner than it's expected. We expect to have the news from Cairo direct. Bob Trout has already given us a report on the fighting in Libya from London. And for further details, Admiral Radio takes you now direct to the Columbia correspondent in Cairo.
The 8th Army, having pushed through the German defenses west of Buarat, continued the attack today and kept up the pressure on Rommel's fighting rear guard. General Montgomery's advanced units were heading up the tarmac road that leads north to Misurata. They were striking across hard desert to the west and northwest. They were pursuing the enemy in 3 directions, while supply columns with fuel and ammunition were piling after them. Latest reports placed British forward troops on a line that runs roughly east to west across 50 miles of Tripolitanian Plateau. The westernmost point on that line is due south of Homs. The battle that picked the Africa Corps out of the Buarat area on Friday night was the first head-on clash the British have had with the enemy since Alamein. But it was not a large-scale battle. Rommel did not pit his whole strength against it. He did not have all his available forces lined up along the Zemzem Gully. He had already withdrawn a fair number of his troops so that he could make a fast getaway when he saw the British steamroller coming. At the same time, he massed enough guns and armor around Zemzem to make the British attack. It was familiar Rommel tactic, delaying as long as he could with a minimum of losses when it came to a showdown. British troops are now rampant in open desert, and I imagine Rommel will have a harder time now than he did at the Gala in keeping the place littered with minefields. But there's no reason to think the 8th Army will have a clean, easy sweep all the way to Tripoli. The eastern approaches to that city are covered by a chain of hills slanting inland from the coast near Homs. So Rommel may practice his favorite delaying technique again. He has an estimated 50,000 troops, including some crack German infantry battalions. Somewhere in the background, he has 3 Italian divisions.
Hier spricht die Stimme aus Amerika.
Zunächst in Kürze die wichtigsten Nachrichten.
Der deutsche Ring um Leningrad wurde von den Russen gesprengt. Die Festung Schlüsselburg befindet sich wieder in russischem Besitz.
Russische Streitkräfte eroberten die Eisenbahnstation Kamjensk, eine der wichtigsten Schlüsselstellungen der Deutschen an der Donezfront.
Die Vernichtung der Reste der vor Stalingrad eingeschlossenen 6. Armee schreitet weiter fort. Sowjettruppen nehmen Stützpunkt nach Stützpunkt der Deutschen in und bei Stalingrad.
Seit dem 19. November, den 2 Monaten der russischen Winteroffensive, hat sich auf deutscher Seite die Zahl der Toten und Gefangenen um mehr als 610.000 Mann erhöht.
In Libyen steht die britische 8. Armee jetzt weniger als 75 Kilometer südöstlich von Tripolis. Rommels Afrikakorps ist weiter auf dem Rückzug.
In den Nächten zum Sonntag und Montag hatte die Royal Air Force 2 Großangriffe auf Berlin ausgeführt. Montagnachmittag griffen britische Flieger Eisenbahnanlagen in Nordfrankreich an. In der Nacht zum Dienstag bombardierte die Royal Air Force Frachtzüge und Lokomotiven in Nordfrankreich. An der holländischen Küste belegten englische Bomber 3 feindliche Schiffe mit Volltreffern.
Auf Neuguinea eroberten Truppen der Vereinten Nationen Sanananda, einen der letzten japanischen Stützpunkte auf der Papua-Halbinsel.
Vor dem schwedischen Parlament erklärte Ministerpräsident Hansen, die schwedische Armee erhielt den Befehl, gegen jeden Invasionsversuch Widerstand bis zum Äußersten zu leisten.
World News Today, brought to you by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations, as well as the leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefronts. But first, here's John Daly.
At this week's beginning, Allied armies in Russia and North Africa are preparing for the second round of their great offensives. The Russian armies have consolidated their positions around Rostov and are now drawing the noose tight around that city. In Libya, with Tripoli in our hands, the 8th Army is smashing on toward Tunisia to join in the battle that is to clear the Axis out of North Africa. In the Pacific, the vicious air and ground fighting continues. The Navy Department gave out more news of that front only a half an hour ago. For that news, Admiral Radio takes you first to CBS Washington, Lee White reporting.
The Navy's just announced that American planes have carried out 7 bombing attacks in the Solomons in the last 2 days, doing heavy damage to the aerodrome at Munda. The Japanese have again bombed our own installations on Guadalcanal and Espiritu Santo. The latest Army communique reports that the Germans have captured yet another strategic height in central Tunisia. If the military situation still seems unfavorable, the political situation seems to have gone from bad to worse. The State Department is under heavier fire than at any time since the North African campaign began. A few days ago, the Washington Post accused the State Department of bungling and demanded the removal of Robert Murphy, our chief political delegate. Then Walter Lippmann added his voice to the clamor. And today, Ernest Lindley, who has a reputation for being a State Department apologist, chided Messrs. Hull and Murphy in no uncertain terms for passing the political buck to the War Department and attempting to make General Eisenhower responsible for what he considers their mistakes.
But that's not all. I.F. Stone, a Washington correspondent of the newspaper PM, charges that Paul H. Appleby resigned from the State Department as a protest against the appointment of the one-time Himmler of Vichy France, Marcel Pérouton, as Governor General of Algeria. Mr. Appleby, a well-known food expert, was lent to the State Department by the Department of Agriculture to take charge of relief operations under Herbert Lehman. But according to PM, he couldn't stomach Pérouton. London still reports rumors of momentous decisions, presumably emanating from Washington. And the same rumors are just as prevalent here, presumably emanating from London. A big story is about to break, and everybody's hoping it will entail a sensible moral solution to the North African problem, as well as the Joint Allied War Council referred to by Wendell Willkie today in his speech in New York. Vice President Wallace also spoke today, predicting a post-war America in which all men can become members of the middle class and share in the benefits which that class has enjoyed in the past. After 13 months of war, Congress is now at last aroused over the growing shortage of labor, and manpower czar McNutt is being subjected to a barrage of criticism that he may not be able to withstand. Tomorrow, the Senate Military Affairs Committee will open hearings to determine why, at this late date, the War Manpower Commission still has no definite program. Senator Austin of Vermont says he and his colleagues will certainly draft a labor mobilization law unless Mr. McNutt can convince them that such legislation is unnecessary. A missing Panagra transport plane with 15 persons aboard has been sighted from the air in the jungles of Peru. A rescue party is now searching for possible survivors. J. Pierpont Moffat, American minister to Canada, died in Ottawa today. I now return you to CBS New York and John Daly.
More news in just a moment. But first, here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
You are one of several million Americans now listening to news reports coming from all over the world by radio. Have you ever considered the part radio has come to play in your life? To most of us, radio is a necessity and a convenience. To American fighting men lined up on over 60 different battlefronts, radio is an absolute essential. It is often their only connection with headquarters and with other fighting units. It is the unifying link which makes coordinated action possible. Admiral has produced radios for both purposes, peace as well as war. In peacetime, Admiral radios were designed for performance and beauty, for the luxury of American homes. In fact, during peacetime, Admiral was the world's largest manufacturer of radio phonograph combinations with automatic record changers. Now, Admiral is producing radios for war, radios which will link America's fighting units together, radios which are sturdy enough to take all the grueling punishment of modern battle and still operate perfectly. Yes, Admiral has pioneered in the production of both the radio of war and the radio of peace. When victory has been won, and with it the blessings of peace, look again to Admiral for exciting new adventures in radio entertainment made possible by today's amazing wartime developments and discoveries. Tomorrow, as always, an Admiral radio will be America's smart set. Now, here once again for Admiral Radio is John Daly.
And now more news of the Pacific. Organized jet resistance in Papua has been ended by American and Australian troops. For the latest details, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS Australia. William J. Dunn reporting.
The Japanese invasion of Papua, of Australian territory, lasted exactly 1 day over 6 months. On July 22nd, the first enemy convoy landed troops at Gona, almost without opposition. Saturday of the week just ended saw the last remnants of that ambitious force completely liquidated, and the epitaph of some thousands of Japanese pinned in the brief communique sentence, "Ground fighting in Papua has ceased." The week just ended has witnessed the wind-up of one of the bitterest campaigns any contingent of green American troops has ever called upon to face. This campaign has been of inestimable value, both to the Americans and their Australian allies. In the months it took to drive the Japanese back across the Owen Stanley Range, isolate them, and finally wipe them out completely, the Allies have learned lessons which could be learned in no other way. As a result of this campaign, we now have military leaders who know this type of warfare, who have outsmarted the enemy in a type of fighting he himself developed, and who can, when necessary, lead fresh troops into jungle or mountain warfare with the confidence that comes only of knowledge. Lieutenant General Eichelberger, who led the American forces in the field before Bina and Sanananda, told me early in December that the greatest gain the Allies could hope for from the fighting then underway was not so much the elimination of an enemy force as the invaluable experience we were then getting, and getting the hard way. Another Tokyo myth has been exploded, and the Allied soldier has emerged from the top one battle as a pretty fair jungle fighter in his own right. This is William J. Dunn in Australia. I return you to CBS in New York.
In Western Europe, British bombers are continuing their round-the-clock attacks on Nazi-occupied Europe. And Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS London, Bob Trout reporting.
From Britain, the Royal Air Force struck again last night at the German U-boat bases in the French Atlantic port of Lorient. The fifth attack on this U-boat base made during January, 4 of them made in the last 10 days. Lorient had not had time to recover from yesterday's daylight attack by Liberators and Flying Fortresses of the USAAF when the RAF bombers were over the port in the moonlight. High explosives and incendiaries, dropped for 20 minutes, started very heavy fires. The men and women of Britain's home front, who know pretty well what this war is about, have, as you know, not been happy about the political muddle in North Africa. This has nothing to do with General Eisenhower, and no responsible person in Britain has ever said it had. What it's about is the basic purpose of this war. Britain's ordinary men and women quickly saw, even last November, that what happens in North Africa is bound to be a small-scale preview of what will happen all over Europe. They didn't like that preview much. The state of affairs exemplified by North Africa is definitely not what they made up their minds long ago they're fighting for. In recent days, the British people have been getting hints that the North African affair is going to be cleared up and properly done as part of a large understanding between Great Britain, Russia, China, and the United States. The four nations, so the hints go, are planning something approaching a General Allied War Council. Curiously enough, the British newspapers attributed these hints to sources inside the United States. And, I suspect, the United States hears that the hints are coming from London. This weekend, the transatlantic rumor barrage reached its climax, in London at any rate, and today's papers are talking about vital decisions, which will soon be announced. Obviously, it's the kind of thing which is not to be talked about too much until the announcement is made. But just in case you have the impression that all Britain knows a secret which the United States does not know, I'll read you the screaming headline from London's Sunday Pictorial, one of Britain's few tabloids. In huge letters it says, "Big news soon, says America." Next to CBS Cairo and the report of Winston Burdett.
The bulk of the Africa Corps, considerably the worst for wear but still an intact fighting force, was falling back into southern Tunisia today while British forward troops were shooting it out with active rear guards somewhere along the coast road between Tripoli and Douala. The 8th Army already was well on its way down the last 100-mile stretch of highway between Tripoli and the Tunisian border. Already British and American fighter bombers are flying from airdromes in the Tripoli area, where the Luftwaffe was operating less than a week ago. Naval and Army engineers have begun work on Tripoli Harbor, getting it back into shape for the convoys which will help supply the 8th Army's next full-scale effort on a battlefront somewhere in Tunisia. Tripoli is a trump card which will resolve many of the supply problems with which the British have been struggling ever since they hit west from Egypt. The Africa Corps in southern Tunisia will also enjoy some new advantages. It will be linked with von Arnim's army in the north by a modern road and rail system. It will stand a better chance of getting reinforcements than it did when it was fighting in the wilderness of Tripolitania. The German command will likewise be able to transfer arms and men from front to front, according to where they are most urgently needed. Von Arnim's army has been consistently strengthened during the past week and is now reported to comprise 2 armored and 1 infantry division, apart from Italian troops. Taking advantage of wet weather, Rommel may prefer to make a stand in the low marshes skirting Gabes Bay rather than in the fortified Mares zone. Somewhere, certainly, he must fight, whether he picks his battlefield in the swampy south or seeks to join up with the Panther Army in the north. In any case, the 8th Army has an appointment in Tunisia, a rendezvous with General Eisenhower's forces, and General Montgomery means to make all haste to keep that rendezvous. I return you now to CBS in New York.
Again, we turn to the Pacific, this time for an eyewitness story of the recent American raid on Jap-held Wake Island. Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS Honolulu. Webley Edwards reporting.
Before Christmas, a large flight of United States Army bombers roared through the moonlit skies of the Central Pacific, heading for historic Wake Island, with orders to demolish Jap installations there. And straight and true, they headed for their target, the little island rocking with explosion after explosion. And when the raid was over, Wake Island's installations were a flaming ruin, and the American planes came home almost without a scratch, all personnel present and accounted for. In fact, they had 1 extra man. And thereby hangs the tale of a man who stowed away on a bomber. I have him with me right here in Honolulu. Sergeant, give us your full name and hometown.
Technical Sergeant Paul W. Sweetheart, sir. Hometown, Tilson, Kansas. My folks live there now.
Why does a man stow away on a bombing plane, Sergeant Sweetheart?
Because I wanted to see action. I thought I'd been waiting about long enough, so I thought I'd see if I couldn't go along somehow.
You figured this all out in advance?
Well, not too far. I was crew chief on one of the planes, Silly the Whack. We take care of the planes after every flight. We check them over before they go out to make sure they come back. If there's anything wrong with them, we fix them up.
The ground crew really lives that slogan, keep 'em flying, then.
A fellow gets to thinking when he takes care of a plane that it's almost his baby. Some of the boys get the feeling that we loan the plane to the pilot and navigator when they take it out.
So when you heard something was up, I guess you're pretty busy.
I'd been grooming the ship to see whether everything was okay. I was in and out of the plane 15 or 20 times. I got to thinking I'd sure like to stick with that plane. I knew that the plane could safely carry a lot more poundage, even for a long distance.
Did you know where the raid was headed?
No, but I knew that it would be a big one. So the last time I went in the plane, I took my parachute and Mae West along. Well, my job when the plane takes off is to see that the props are clear and to watch the engine from behind. I went up front and gave the pilot the high sign that everything was okay. Then I ran back and went in the rear of the plane and hid. Everybody was up forward, and I made it without being spotted. I stayed put for a while until we were well up. And then I came out of hiding. The crew was quite surprised to see me.
To say the least. What'd they do?
A tail gunner saw me and asked, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm going along." And he said, "Looks like you are." But Lieutenant Samuel Gregory, the pilot, and all the crew were pretty nice about it. I made myself useful wherever I could. I transferred into this outfit hoping I'd get to be a gunner. And I figured if any of the boys got hurt, I could take their place. Fortunately, nobody got hurt, but I was ready.
Well, what happened when you got back, Sergeant Sweetheart?
I was plenty worried. After we landed, I got busy checking the plane, and nobody said anything for a while. But I caught it later on. The colonel didn't punish me, but I and everybody else was given to understand that it hadn't better happen again.
And that's the story of Sergeant Paul Sweetheart, who stowed away on the big Wake Island raid by United States Army bombers. Ladies and gentlemen, there will be no more stowaways on Army bombers. I'm advised by Colonel William A. Matheny, Group Commander, that strict orders have been issued against the possibility of any stowaways in any future operation. And other commanding officers have done the same. But this story, and it's a good one, adds proof to the intense eagerness of the young men in our armed forces out here to get into action. This is Webley Edwards in Honolulu. We return you to CBS in New York.
Russia's noon communique, general rather than specific in its claims, announced that several more populated places were taken in the Voronezh area and that the Red Armies in the North Caucasus have taken a town of great strategic importance after an advance of 13 miles. Thus, the armies of South Russia closed the iron ring around Rostov. The capture of Armaver, announced yesterday, puts the Russians 110 miles south of the city, astride the main rail line running right into Rostov. Another Russian army is moving up the Manch River Valley towards Rostov and is only 80 miles away. In addition, north and northeast of the city, other Red armies are steamrolling over German defenses, are only 56 to 90 miles from Rostov, and have already taken most of the rail communications which the Germans needed to maintain isolated forces in the Don Valley. The recent developments in the Caucasus have completely unhinged the German defenses, and the Nazi forces in the Mykorp oil region are in danger of being cut off, as were the 22 divisions at Stalingrad. One of the most important bits of news out of Russia today affects the Axis force trapped at Stalingrad. The Russian communique reported that a German battalion surrendered en masse, in spite of the tales of torture and death for prisoners taken by the Russians spread by the German officers. This development may well mean that the entire Axis force remaining may surrender in the near future, thus releasing many Russian divisions for the offensives against Rostov and Kharkov. The German communique describing the fighting in Russia is full of evasive phrases. It speaks of shortening the southern front according to plan, and says that the fighting in the northern Caucasus has shifted to the Kuban Plain, which is an obvious roundabout way of saying that the German armies in that area are retreating just about as fast as they can. In describing the plight of the Axis force trapped at Stalingrad, the communique falls all over itself. It says that the Axis positions there become intensified through further breaches by strong Russian masses from the west, but at the same time, it said that the defenders held unbroken. The Russians say that of the 220,000 men of the German Sixth Army originally trapped at Stalingrad, less than 40,000 remain. In Chicago, in the former Hotel Stevens, our Air Force is training men in the technical aspects of their part of the war. And for a report from this headquarters, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS Chicago, Bill Slocum, Jr. reporting.
It has been my lot in recent weeks, while the boys in New York were checking the signal from Algiers, to do brief and often unintelligible little masterpieces from strange places, such as submarines, paratroop planes, and patrol planes, but never from so unusual a spot as the scene of this epic. I'm standing on a balcony, a gold one, too, and above me are some gleaming crystal chandeliers, and below me are 600 or 700 hungry men packing away their dinner with some grace and unbelievable enthusiasm. They are all soldiers learning the art of radio transmission and reception at the Army Air Force's Technical Training Command's Unit Number 1, Chicago, which was once the Stevens, the world's largest hotel. When the Army took over the Stevens August 1st, every bit of luxury equipment was moved out in 13 nights. It took 1,000 vans to move it all, and as quickly as a room was cleared, it was refurnished with what the Army insists are beds. No fewer than 2 double-deckers in any room, and as many as 5 or 6 in the suites. During the recent Democratic conventions, the Stevens was CBS News headquarters, so I was sure nothing would surprise me in this hostelry. But the picture of a squad of steel-helmeted soldiers marching out of an elevator set me back, although I could not quite erase the thought that we could have used them in those hectic convention days. They can feed 5,000 students thrice daily in this mess hall, which was once the grand ballroom. It's a sort of a perpetual mess hall, because here at the Stevens, men sleep while others study. Downstairs in the huge exhibition halls, there are now 24 radio mechanics classrooms with laboratories installed around the outside walls. The coffee shop is the Post Exchange restaurant, and the flower shop is now the Provost Marshal's office. Up on the 3rd floor, there are even more classrooms. The job the Army Air Forces is doing here is a tough one. Thousands, and I can't tell you how many thousands of youngsters, are being taught ROM, which means radio operator mechanic. That means they can make radios work, no matter whether they are sending the signal from the towers of Bowling Field in Washington or from a bouncing B-25 over Tokyo. They have so many embryo radio men here that the Chicago Park Commission built an overpass over Michigan Boulevard in front of the hotel. It seems the unending stream of soldiers crossing the Bull Mish to drill tied up traffic in all directions. There are lots of women in the hotel, because as much of the staff as possible was kept, and many of the teachers are girls. I asked Brigadier General Albert L. Sneed, in command of the vast schooling setup here, how these boys, most of whom never saw the inside of an airplane, felt about the hazards of flying compared to the comparative safety of ground and tower operations. They all want action, he told me. They want to get into planes. They work hard here, and they're anxious to get out. They want to fight. I return you now to CBS in New York and John Daly.
And now Admiral Radio brings you Columbia's military expert, Major George Fielding Elliott.
One of the most important questions which remains unanswered at this moment is the remaining striking power of Marshal Rommel's famous Africa Corps as it withdraws into Tunisia. It will find awaiting it strong defensive positions covering the approaches from Tripoli into Tunisia, the famous Mareth Line. On this line, Rommel may be able to make a stand with his infantry units, leaving his mobile elements free to operate behind the line in southern and central Tunisia to protect the east coast ports of Gabis, Sfax, and Sousse, on which he depends for supplies and reinforcements, and to cooperate with the German forces already in Tunisia to clear a wider space for maneuver and gain greater depth for defense.
And now Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
During the next few weeks, Admiral dealers expect to be swamped with calls for radio service. Radio will become more important than ever to the home. Wage earners will want all possible information on the new income tax report they must file, and housewives will want to keep abreast of point rationing, especially as to the constantly changing point values of the various foods. People know they'll depend on their radios for such information, yet many, whose radios aren't performing as well as they should, won't call their Admiral dealer for service until the last minute. We'd like to advise you to call your Admiral dealer now. He's still able to get replacements for most parts, and his skill is unquestioned. Almost any radio, regardless of make or condition, can be made as good as new by your Admiral dealer quickly, so you won't miss your favorite programs, and economically, so your budget won't be upset. Above all, don't try to repair your radio yourself, and don't put it in the hands of an unskilled person. One little slip, and you may be without a radio for the duration. Be sure, call your Admiral dealer. Get the job done right. This week, Americans everywhere are uniting to stamp out infantile paralysis. Don't neglect making your contribution. You won't if you remember that tomorrow's America will be as strong as today's children. Help make America strong. Give generously to the campaign to fight infantile paralysis. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from the leading news centers of the world. Warren Sweeney speaking. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
This is the